When the second and much larger wave of bombers began to attack Altgarten, it wasn't fear that dominated the minds of its citizens, nor, although this was in many minds, was it simple anger or a feeling of being victimized by fate. It was a neurosis of a kind that comes from being asked to do something beyond one's mental and physical capability. Life had got out of control. For the professionals, their jobs had got out of control. The fire service officers had spent their lives handling one fire at a time with a plentiful supply of water and the telephones in working order. Tonight, they faced over 100 fires, many of them large and out of control. They were hampered by broken water mains, disconnected phones and exploding bombs. Now, just as they had the emergency power and phone lines almost complete and the water was pumping from the Munchenstrasse sewer, it was going to start all over again. There were many symptoms of this neurosis, and for some survivors it was the beginning of a mental breakdown from which they would never recover. One senior fireman was singing an old music hall ditty over and over again as he worked at the pump. Several of the firemen at the hoses were speaking to the fire, swearing at it in a confused, obscene mumble. At the Volksschule of Blockwart, after warning a group of people of the dangers of throwing water onto a burning incendiary bomb, had picked it up as though it was the demonstration dummy and inflicted upon himself very severe burns. When the second wave of bombers began their attack, both Gerd Bull and his friend Bodo Reuter knew that it was going to be even bigger than the first wave. This was the way the Tommies worked, and the fast-revving British engines were as loud as a swarm of hornets. Salvos of bombs were centering on the fires. The noise hammered their eardrums and the blast plucked at their bodies. They both knew that a sensible man would take cover, but they moved up Munchenstrasse towards the hospital fire in leaps and runs, punctuated by long waits, flat on their faces. There were several damaged lorries in the street. One, an army lorry, was on fire. They passed it cautiously and then kept close to the walls until the last block before Dorfstrasse, where conscientious civil defense men were throwing burning bedclothes and furniture into the street from a fire on the top floor. Even before they turned the corner into Dorfstrasse, they could see the fire at the hospital reflected in the wet roadway. The main street seemed to be running in blood as the brightly lit water rippled along the gutter. The air was full of sparks, and the ground so littered with burning wreckage and incendiary bombs left to burn themselves out that Reuter trod into a patch of phosphorus. The goo burst into flame as he tried to scrape it from his boot. It was an evil, frightening substance that clung like glue. Reuter put his boot into the water-filled gutter, which extinguished the flame, but immediately afterwards it ignited again in the air. Finally, Gerd used a piece of broken brick to scrape it away. Then they resumed their journey. Now they were stepping more carefully around the burning timber and white-hot magnesium fragments from the incendiaries. They passed more than 100 fires on their short journey and 7 times threw themselves full length to the ground as high explosive bombs dropped nearby. 5 times they were implored to give assistance in rescuing trapped people, but they refused, and even the angriest of civilians knew better than to argue with a T&O officer. Some of them, seeing Bodo's high collar, cuff band and black rank patches thought he was in the Waffen-SS. During the second wave's attack, the fires got out of control. Even the most heroic firemen cannot survive a barrage of high explosive bombs, and the bomb loads of the second wave bombers had been planned with this in mind. Even after the last of the bombers had departed, the effectiveness of the firefighting and salvage teams would be hampered by the delayed action bombs. They would continue to explode for 2 more days. Gerd Bull and Bodo Reuter always stayed together. They had diffused bombs and tunneled under masonry and walked across planks high in the air, each confident that the other would never let him down. Gerd Bull stayed with Reuter, and Reuter's place was with his men at the hospital. 200 at least, sir, said Reuter's Hauptwachmeister, perhaps more, And that doesn't include the nurses who are up there with them. And the basement? Asked Gerd. Another 100. They can get out, but there's nowhere to take them, and they aren't exactly mobile. Some can hardly walk, let alone run.
No one on the top floor? That's gone. It's just ashes up there. What's that sound? Like singing, said Reuter. Screaming, said the old NCO. When there's an explosion nearby or they see an incendiary, they call out together. There's no panic, but being bedridden up there with a view across the city must be rather sobering tonight. He gave a grim smile. The structure? Asked Reuter. All the front has gone and the steel went with it. The top floor is tilting according to one of the men who've just come down. You've been up? Half an hour ago. Herr Oberzugführer, let's go up and take another look. Bring a couple of messengers and a couple of strong fellows with ropes and axes.
The journey up to the 4th floor was slow and circuitous, but not dangerous. They used the service staircase as far as the 2nd floor, and although it was pitch dark and littered with large pieces of debris, it was intact. They passed through a crowded children's ward on the 2nd floor and down a corridor littered with wet, burned blankets. Through an office door on the left, they glimpsed a surgeon carrying out an operation. Rembrandt-like lighting was provided by 2 oil lamps, an electric torch, and 5 candles. They went through the broken doors to the old building and up the winding staircase. That was tricky, for in places the cantilevered stone steps had broken, leaving only broken stumps for toeholds, with a nasty view downwards that included sharp stonework projections. Now and again they were splashed. Jets of water were striking the top of the stairwell and falling upon them in a fine spray. They waited patiently while another squad of Tino men and firemen lowered a door down the staircase shaft. As the door twisted, Gerd saw the white face of an old man strapped tight against the board. His arms were slightly extended, like those of a wooden doll. In short jerks, he was lowered past them without a sound, revolving gently, his face transfixed, eyes wide and mouth open. He was trying to remember how to scream. Since Bodo's NCO had last visited the top floor, the roof had collapsed on one room, killing 4 radiographers. The floor tilted more now, and there were cracks in the wall large enough to see through. Every minute or two, the whole building groaned like an old man who has sat too long in one position. And like an old man, it leaned a little more to one side, always to the same side. "Stay close to this wall," Reuter ordered his men. The floor lurched under them. The walls were bulging as the bricks expanded. The metal girders expanded too, pressed against the ceiling, writhing in the heat. They fired hot rivets across the room like bullets. "How fast are they getting these people down?" asked Bodo. "One team down the staircase, one by the air shaft. They are each taking about 7 minutes.
"Get the nurses out of here," said Bodo. "And the patients?" "Get the nurses out." His Hauptwachmeister gave a perfunctory salute and turned to bellow at the men. "You heard what the Oberzugführer said. Evacuate all nurses to ground level. We will start on this floor." Without delay, the Tennos hurried after the NCO, rounding up the nursing staff and ordering them to leave their patients. The nurses began to argue. But orders are orders. "How long do you think?" "Bodo, not more than 10 minutes. "Gerd." Neither Bodo nor Gerd saw the first row of beds go. One of the Tenno messengers swore and a nurse screamed, and then the far end of the ward was empty. The light of the fire lit the ceiling, for there was no longer any wall. It had exploded out into the courtyard, along with the beds and people. The second row of beds screeched as they slid across the tilted lino, for the wheels had the safety brakes on. But gravity was too much for that device. The beds collided and interlocked.
Thrashing blanketed bundles grabbed at pillars and lost their fingernails. A nurse overbalanced and she toppled over. She slid on her bottom across the highly polished floor, trying to hold her flying skirts down all the way until she fell off the edge and into the courtyard 2 stories below. They were screaming now, hysterical screaming which neither alerts nor implores. Fatalistic yells and high-pitched cries were the final denunciation of an unjust world. The Tennos linked hands. Gerd, Bodo and one of the Tenno men had each grabbed a patient out of bed and sharing the weight of their limp bodies. The 6 Tennos and Gerd inched their way from one handhold to the next along the hot, bulging wall. Outside, the bombs were exploding and flares were lighting the streets as bright as day. Shadows moved drunkenly, and there was the continuous whine of shell fragments. The building was creaking and groaning now that the far end of the steel structure had collapsed. They felt the whole building sway with each explosion like a house of cards being blown upon. Each time dust and plaster fell noisily from the ceiling and sent up clouds of dirt. The abandoned patients were making more noise now. But the Tennos tried to close their minds to the distant cries. They roped each of the 3 patients at the top of the circular staircase, and 2 of the men went down to receive the lowered bodies. The stairwell was dark. The heat was coming up it like a chimney, and there were bits of charred cloth and paper whisked skywards past them as they searched with their boots for the stone toe-holds. For a moment, a green flare directly above them lit the stairs like daylight, for there was no longer any roof. And then it drifted past, leaving them in an even more baffling darkness. "Let me die," one white-haired old man said repeatedly as they passed the rope under his arms. The stone was hot to his bare feet, and he danced painfully upon the top step.
"Let me die. Just let me die." "Shut up, you old fool!" Bodo shouted finally. "I'll tell you when you can die." "Jawohl, Herr Leutnant," said the old man in a clipped, obedient voice that he hadn't used since 1918. The Tennos worked without haste, testing each knot and examining each handhold, but their faces were flushed and sweat dripped off their chins. One of them took off his steel helmet and tried to clip it to his belt, but in the darkness he fumbled and the helmet fell down the stairwell, ringing like a cracked bell as it hit the broken steps and bounced from wall to wall. One by one, the nurses from the top floor were coaxed, helped, and handled down the stairwell. Then the patients were lowered on ropes. At last it was time to lower the last of the survivors. It was a woman scarcely conscious and whimpering softly as they fastened the rope around her. "Soon have you down, Mother," Gerd encouraged her. She smiled in friendly disbelief. The steadying rope burned through when she was halfway down, and she spun slowly round as the support ropes shrank with the heat. Gerd was halfway down the staircase, his steel-tipped boots wedged against the remaining inch or 2 of broken stair, and his hands searching for a handhold. He spared a hand to grab at her spinning body and managed to slow the dizzying movement as she was lowered past him. She was still smiling. "Nearly there," said Gerd. It was the Tenno at the bottom who called up that she was dead. His voice echoed in the slim stone stairwell like some gatekeeper of the lower world. That was when the whole of the old building collapsed, throwing beds and bedridden into the courtyard in one great heap of broken people. 6 minutes, said Gerd. "Yes," admitted Bodo. "Damn them. We could have cleared those wards in another 15. On the ground floor, one of the storage rooms for X-ray plates was on fire. Thick smoke was rolling down the stairs into the basement, and many of the nurses were wearing wet masks. In the courtyard, torches flashed over the bent iron bedsteads and bloody blankets that were heaped upon the stone flags. It was senseless to worry about the blackout when the whole town was burning bright and visible for 100 miles. Here and there, the nurses and men were extricating a still-living body. "Stretcher party," they called. But it wasn't easy for a stretcher party to pick its way through the heap of 200 bodies without treading on others that were still moving and groaning. "Bomb's gone," said Digby, his voice completely relaxed.
When the two 250 phosphorus bombs from Creaking Door hit the old building, the quick dropped flat upon the dead. The phosphorus bombs threw their showers of white sparks 60 feet into the air, and they came down as pretty as fireworks with large fragments of burning phosphorus. A cluster of fragments struck Johannes Ilfer's legs. He knifed it away from the fabric and flesh, but some were deeply embedded. Around him, men screamed and fought and burned and sometimes survived. They wriggled like live bait, and a few regained their feet, like ghosts arising from a mass grave. Water had no effect upon phosphorus. The official instructions were to cover it in sand. Can you put sand upon a man's face? Already Ilfer was finding it easier to reject the pleas of those too far gone to be saved. It was right to do so, and logical too, but Ilfer told himself that it was one more step on the journey to inhumanity. Ilfer, with most of the phosphorus splashes cut away, came coughing and spluttering through the smoke and heavy phosphorus fumes. The trim young fireman looked at the elderly Tenno officer before saluting. "Have your people got breathing apparatus, Herr Oberzugführer?" "It's 10 minutes away," said Bodo. His false teeth hurt him, and he bit hard on his knuckle. "Then with your permission, we'll put my fellows in to sort through the bodies." Ilfer coughed again. "If only we could damp them down. There's not enough water for that unless we abandon the post office," said Johannes Ilfer. "What about the swimming baths?" Ilfer wiped his moustache, which, like his face, was glistening with water from the hoses. He'd used all the water from the municipal baths when they first ran short. Now he looked at the thin old Tenno man and grinned. "Sorry," said Bodo Reuter. Like members of a secret society, the two men recognized in each other the skills and judgment that were in such short supply this night. They looked up to the building opposite, upon which most of the water was being sprayed in an effort to prevent the fire spreading to that block. "It's quite a mess," said Ilfer tentatively. "It bloody well is," said Bodo. "I don't envy you trying to sort out that heap if the bodies ignite." "My firemen are only kids," said Ilfer. Bodo nodded. But how old could this fireman be? His middle 20s, perhaps. And yet now he walked across a dozen bodies without a trace of hesitation in his step, as limbs flaked underfoot like charcoal logs. There was a hesitant cough. Fuchs Überall was at Bodo's elbow. His flushed face and dilated eyes gave a clue to his suppressed hysteria. His voice was comically high-pitched. "I can't go on. Bodo! Can't. I picked up a child, and it came to pieces in my hands. Bodo, can I go and give a hand with the digging? I'll send one of the boys back here. He came to pieces." Bodo Reuter grabbed his drinking companion by the collar and turned it to squeeze his throat. "I'm not Bodo, you narr. I'm Oberzugführer Reuter, and you'll call me sir. And you'll stand with your feet together and salute. And you'll do what you're told, without argument and discussion or hesitation, because you Überall, but I swear to you by anything you can find to hold sacred right now that I will take a gun and blow your brains out if I so much as see you pause long enough to wipe the sweat off your big fat face. Now go." He threw the man back towards the heap of bodies. Überall stumbled and fell, and as he got to his feet, Reuter screamed, "Understand!" Like some young recruit, Überall sprang to attention and yelled, "Yes, Herr Oberzugführer, Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler!" said Bodo Reuter, and to himself he said, "They're not bowling, my friend." "No, they're not bowling," said Gerd Burl. Everywhere there were pieces of phosphorus. It lit up the whole place and gave off enough heat to ignite body fat. Dead and dying were exploding with the same surprising flash with which a frying pan ignites in the hands of a careless chef. Hair burned even more readily, and the phosphorus and burning hair and flesh produced dense black smoke that attacked the eyes and mucus of the nostrils and made men choke and splutter. The heat was unimaginable, and even the veterans were daunted by it. The largest pile of bodies was now blazing, and no one could approach it. "Breathing apparatus," said Johannes Ilfer. He put his own on, and it hurt him, as he knew it would. He needed to inhale deeply to bring the air through the filters, and each breath hurt his damaged lung. The fire squad with its breathing apparatus moved slowly, like deep-sea divers. The nurses and the tenno men and the medical students and the fire watchers, the policemen and the block warden and the soldiers, and the cripples who had tried to help the dying, withdrew. They climbed over the hot debris. A fabric woven of wood, brick and bodies. Their steps were lit by pieces of blazing phosphorus. Still chunks of brickwork and liquid roof lead fell into the courtyard. But all the rescue workers reached the road except for 8 nurses and 7 men who were near the west wall of the old building when the chimney complex of the annex collapsed upon them. Johannes Ilfer had manned hoses, operated pumps, and climbed over burning roofs. Splashes of phosphorus mottled his legs and, in spite of his knife work, were eating deep into his flesh, burning with a foul smell. One of the youngest trainees reported Ilfer's wounds, and he was ordered to a dressing station. Neither Gerd nor Bodo spoke of the 200 men and women who had died in the courtyard. It was a taboo subject not subsequently mentioned, except perhaps to a new recruit by someone who was there. Even then it was only after too many drinks and men spoke of it in whispers. What was left of the old wing of the hospital had been pressed into use as a treatment centre. Here the dim lights of the emergency generator threw the scene into extremes of light and dark. Most of the patients were known to the doctors as they were wheeled in for surgery. "Hello, Dr. Mara," said a girl who had been brought into the hospital for tonsillitis. "We're going to have to take that arm off." "Fräulein, you'll feel much better then. Believe me." The outpatients' waiting room had been converted into a multiple operating theatre in which 8 doctors worked at once. A policeman with a bucket and pump hosed down the blood from the lino, and a garbage can for severed limbs was wheeled through the ward on a tea trolley. In the corridor, Johannes Ilfer, still cherishing his secret passion for Anna Luisa, was ignoring his pain. He had been arguing stubbornly with a nurse who wanted to cut away his trousers to examine the phosphorus burns on his thighs. Now that he had rested for a while, he began to realize how weak he had become. His lung hurt him more than ever. The nurse was a young trainee, and she had no idea why the fireman was making such a fuss until a middle-aged ward sister came along. She had a piratical array of surgical instruments stuck into her belt, and her hair had been frizzled by fire. She pulled her face mask down. "Don't be so stupid," she said angrily. "Do you think you're the only one here who has soiled underwear?" Many had involuntarily emptied their bowels that night, but for Johannes Ilfer his decorum was to prove fatal. By the time his trousers and underpants were cut away, he had died. Along the corridor came 2 nurses in fancy dress, homemade kimonos and coloured sashes. One of them had been badly splashed with blood. Bodo Reuter watched the nurse tip Ilfer's slim body off the bench to make room for the living. Bodo took it by the hand as if to say goodbye and heaved it over his shoulder in a fireman's lift. "We'll put him somewhere," said Bodo. "Yes, let's get out of here," said Gerd. "It gives me the creeps." Outside in Dorfstrasse, they put the body on the front seat of his Magirus fire engine before walking back along the hose lines. "He knew his job," said Bodo. "Yes," said Gerd. That accolade served as his epitaph, for he got no other. The sump constructed by blocking the sewer was still the main supply. But paper and sewage continually clogged the filters, and the firemen had to pick them clean every few minutes, which left the hoses squelching air until the filters went back into the stinking water again. The night air was hot, but the men handling the hoses were shivering with cold, and their hands were white, numb and stiff. A group of Tinos had 3 hoses on the far side of the courtyard, dousing the neighboring buildings that were not on fire. They soaked the walls of the post office and killed the deadly sparks. But the pump's 500 gallons per minute was falling in shallow curves, short of the post office roof. "Disconnect 2 of those hoses," said Bodo, "or you'll never reach the next roof." The men hurried to obey, "and bring the pressure up to 10 kilograms. Gerd and Bodo waited while they disconnected the junction. This was difficult to do while the water was pumping, but a young fireman from the town fire service helped them. As the new pressure moved through the hose, it bulged like a maddened snake, lashing from side to side in a frenzy that needed 4 tennos to control. The new jet of water made a freezing draft that punched a hole through the black smoke, and the firemen ducked their heads close to the nozzle of the hose to see through the tunnel of fast-moving clear air that fanned their faces. The air was full of flying sparks like luminous locusts, with larger red embers floating gently downwards from the nearby fires. Each flash of light from the bombers' photo-flash bombs, or from the explosions, illuminated the airborne flotsam. Some of the citizens of Altgarten were to survive to tell a story that the RAF dropped leaflets that night. Stories circulated of dire and ugly warnings of more raids to come. But although leaflets were dropped upon northern France that night, Altgarten got only bombs. The air was full of charred paper, some of it 1,000 feet in the sky, but it had all come from the town itself. There were bills, wills, manifests, invoices, handbills, bonds, shares, love letters, warrants, carbons, dockets, leases, passes, deeds and misdeeds. Their scorched shapes floated on the warm wind and fell back upon the town like black snow. Filing cabinets, deed tins, safes and post boxes were among the night's casualties. And one letter that journeyed 1/4 of a mile into the air upon the thermal of the Näringstrasse bakery fire had been posted by Gerd Böll that afternoon. His letter to August Bach came down in Lieberfrauplatz and was run over by a T&O lorry, ripped by a fireman's boot and floated down a gutter into a drain and was lost in the sewer. It reappeared in pieces and was plucked off the hose filter several times until it softened and shredded and went through the wire mesh. It was only tiny specks of grey pulp when it came out of the hose nozzle and was sprayed into the heart of the fires that, in spite of all efforts, had started on the post office roof. "Look!" shouted someone from the darkness, as high in the black air above them. A Lancaster was hit and exploded in a red, oily ball of flame. There was another bomber on fire too, but it kept steadily on its bombing run. 4 spots of radar-controlled flak burst in a line under and beside it, and finally, as its bombs fell away, the flak blew it to pieces right over the target. It is impossible to forget the smell of a bombarded town. Under the sudden strange whiff of spilled perfume, chemicals or food, there is the constant stale aroma of wet cloth, charred wood and spent explosive. But dominating all else there is the smell of the compacted earth that has cradled the sewer pipes and the acrid stink of the dust from ancient bricks. Many of the rescue workers had tied wet handkerchiefs across their faces and had to drag them away in order to speak. "Don't take the child away. He must tell us where his family were sheltering, or we'll be sifting through this rubble for weeks." Herr Hollander had a busy night. He'd visited 20 apartments to be sure that no firebombs were burning there. Between times, he had put his head into the dark cellar where his flock was sheltering. He logged each visit, and on the last one, he had seen the bomber in flames above the city. As usual, he called. "Raid is still continuing, but our brave fighters are giving the swine something to remember." And as usual, no one replied. The bombing was heavy enough to persuade him to stay there for a few moments. It was dark and fetid, and since the 4,000-pound cookie had dropped across the road, the fans were no longer working. Not that anyone had complained about that. They were automata. These local people, thought Hollander. They made good money in the brewery, for the Wehrmacht would buy all the beer that could be brewed. On overtime, even a labourer had a fat pay packet at the week's end. Some even had more pay than him. It was disgraceful. Now they were not even polite enough to make room for him to sit down. He looked at their coarse hands and dull bovine faces, and the way their thick bodies had slumped against the support beams or fallen upon their neighbours' shoulders. One young girl had her head thrown back and her mouth wide open in a most unattractive manner. Sometimes he wished he could find a house in the Altmarkt or Münchenstrasse, the nice end, or even the new estate. On the other hand, his place in Kaiserin Augustastrasse was so near his place of work, and so cheap. The electricity had gone off and the oil lamps were spluttering in the foul air. He flashed his torch around to be sure that no one was smoking. That was strongly forbidden. It was as silent as a tomb. When Hollander realized exactly what had happened, he let out a little yelp of fear. Or was it pain? Or perhaps compassion? Everyone in the shelter with him was dead, and had been for a long time. He had been visiting corpses. 86 men. Women and children with ruptured lungs had died without so much as gasping for breath. The human lung is a delicate device. Even a pressure of 70 pounds per square inch will damage it beyond repair. The cookie near the brewery had done it. One of the first bombs that dropped. Terrified, Hollander backed towards the door and tripped over some sandbags. He fell heavily. He was an old man, his brittle thigh bone fractured, and the torch went out. The shadows from the oil lamps flickered eerily, but Hollander knew enough first aid to realize that dragging himself to the door could tear a jagged edge of bone across the femoral artery and bleed him to death. He remained where he was. The rescue workers said he had a narrow escape. 2 days later, an astounded doctor made an X-ray of Hollander's lungs and sent it to a medical school in Cologne. Firemen with breathing apparatus were salvaging the living from the mountain of dead in the courtyard. Now there was enough water to spray the hoses upon the workers. Their clothes were so hot that the water hissed and steamed as it fell upon them. At Kaiserin Augustastrasse 94, a man had insisted upon re-entering his blazing home to get his insurance papers and had burned to death. At 1 o'clock on the northern section of Dorfstrasse, 3 men found with suitcases full of new shirts and sausages were summarily executed by a policeman. It was glass splinters in the sausage that made him certain they were looters. Frenzel's Stube had proved impossible to save, and although the Frenzel family were finally forced to evacuate the place, 43 bodies laid out there were incinerated when French brandy in the cellar exploded. Frau Pipert, who had walked home along Neringstrasse, helped to extricate a young policeman from a burning building and held him while a medical student amputated his trapped arm with a penknife. The policeman later recovered. 4 Vorlib incendiary bombs had hit the police station next door to the Rathaus and had been discovered and extinguished, although not before a senior fireman, who should have known better, had directed his hose onto a high-voltage cable and killed himself and rendered 2 other firemen unconscious for 15 minutes. The shock shredded their trousers into rags, and for the rest of the night they worked bare-legged. It was a police motorcyclist who picked his way through the littered streets looking for Bodo. "Herr Oberzugführer Reuter?" He saluted, and almost before Bodo returned the salute, he was relaying his message and already eyeing the debris, deciding where there was sufficient space to turn his motorcycle combination. "A Tommy has landed on Frau Kirsten's farm. It is of vital importance that the crew do not destroy their aircraft before it can be examined." Bodo nodded. He knew that certain parts must be sent to the special electronics laboratory that the Luftwaffe had set up in Dachau concentration camp. Jewish scientists were trying to discover the RAF's most cherished secret, the magnetron valve of the centimetric radar. "Immediately," he acknowledged. "I shan't go with you," said Gerd Burl. "I'll get back to my cousin's house. His child and the housekeeper are in the cellar." "This is important," urged Bodo. They both knew that Gerd would say, "Not to me it isn't." Gerd nodded. "A moment, please." Bodo called to the policeman. "Take this man to Münchenstrasse." "Yes." "Herr Oberzugführer," said the policeman. Gerd climbed into the Zeppelin-like sidecar, and using his powerful torch he helped the driver around the piles of timber and bricks. He looked back to Bodo and impulsively gave him a simian wave and pulled a face. Bodo waved and turned away. In the center of the street outside the hospital annex there was a T&O lorry on fire. The fire inside the building was so strong that the flames from the lorry were drawn horizontally towards the building. The motorcyclist drove round the lorry and by the light of it could see 50 yards down the road. As they reached Zillestrasse, the lorry's fuel tank exploded with a tremendous boom. Entombed in the cellar, Anna Luisa heard the lorry explode but was still not afraid. She had the child to comfort, and in doing so, she stilled her own fears. This basement had once been a kitchen, and near the steps, she found a small service lift. Its shaft was filled with rubble, but alongside it on the wall there was a speaking tube. She shouted into the tube too, but there was no answer. She could still hear explosions, and she decided that most people would be sheltering from the bombs. "We're safest where we are, Hansel," she said. "There is no hurry to go anywhere." She fingered the fine silver and Meissen figures, but without coveting them. "I shall always love your father, Hansel." The little boy smiled. Everyone loved Daddy. Had Sweet been able to inspect his own complexion at close quarters at that moment, he would have detected the faint, bluish skin pallor that warns of anoxia. His connection had torn and he was getting very little oxygen into his face mask. The symptoms are an ebullient feeling of well-being and optimism far beyond that warranted by circumstances. Anoxia is a little like being cozily intoxicated. Theoretically, Sweet was right about the burning wing. At normal temperatures, the fuel-air mixture in any partially full fuel tank is too rich to ignite, but the port-outer tank of his Lancaster was not at normal temperature. At 20,000 feet. This summer's night was very cold, and so too were the aircraft and its fuel load. The ragged edge of vapor fire trailing aft of the tank had done nothing to raise its temperature. Inside the tank, the less volatile particles of fuel had condensed and thus weakened the fuel-air mixture. This is where the theory went wrong. The fuel was not only inflammable, but highly explosive. The rubber seal at the damaged aft edge of the tank had been on fire for several minutes. As it melted, burning rubber dribbled through the broken seam. The petrol splashing about inside, in spite of the baffles, doused the first few smouldering dribbles, but finally an extra-large one was sucked in by the vibrating seam. It produced the perfect conditions for an explosion. Sweet thought that it was a direct hit by a flak shell. He would never change his mind. The concussion smashed much of the canopy perspex and threw him sideways against his harness. The control column and rudder bar were momentarily wrenched out of his hands. Sweet was not sure what damage had been done, but Murphy, who had been expecting such an explosion, guessed exactly what had happened. When the 114-gallon fuel tank exploded, this broke the wing at the port outer engine. At the same time, it fractured that engine's main girder at its point of attachment under the wing and partially severed a support at the wing's leading edge. Lacking that support, the burning engine began to buffet violently, and within 15 seconds, it too tore itself away from what remained of the main plane. When the section of wing broke away, the Lancaster continued for half a minute in an only slightly curving line. Then, its engine gone, the balance changed drastically. Lightened by the loss of the great 12-cylinder Merlin, the port wing tilted upwards, gathering momentum. The huge bomber was beginning a roll. Sweet and Murphy put all their weight behind the control column, but the port aileron and the section of wing attached to it had floated off into the darkness. The starboard aileron was little more than rags. Without ailerons to correct its antics, Sweet and Murphy watched thunderstruck, while half a dozen tiny orange spiders crawled up the starboard window and continued their movement over the clear perspex roof and, faster now, hurried down the port window. That was Altgarten on fire. Each spider was half a city block blazing furiously. The huge aeroplane had rolled completely over. Murphy had grabbed for his parachute and clipped it on as the plane began its roll. He knew that it must continue now. It would roll faster until centrifugal force made it impossible to escape from the bomber. Already his knees had buckled, and he felt his whole weight pressing against the cockpit floor and forcing him down towards the step in the nose position, several feet below. Gripping the edge of the trunking around the throttle controls and projecting formers and metal edges, he dragged himself towards the black rectangle of night, kicking the fixtures of the folding seat to help him along. Once his broad shoulders were pinned over the edge of the bomb bay housing, centrifugal force threw him headfirst into the bomb aimer's position. His oxygen tube and microphone lead were throttling him. He tore them off his head, but not before hearing Sweet say, "No need to panic. I've got her." Already the Lancaster, with engines roaring, was beginning its second roll. It was moving faster now. The colored lights and flames came nearer the transparent nose. She was tipping over into a spin. Frantically, he bent his knees to get his boot heel against the flat front of the bomb bay. Panic-stricken, he kicked himself against the stiff airstream that smashed at him like an invisible sledgehammer. Inch by inch, and using every ounce of strength his leg muscles could give, he forced his body lower. The edge of the hatch bit into his body and caught every belt and buckle of his harness. Sweating and almost exhausted, his last kick got him into the black, cold night. The centrifugal force threw him in a curve. As the curving fall flattened, he found that he himself was spinning head over heels in a crouching position, his face close against his knee. He knew that he must not open his parachute until the spinning body stopped. But it did not stop. He waited for what seemed like an hour, until the lights flashing past him were dangerously close. And then he pulled the ripcord anyway. The canopy and lines tumbled out of the brown canvas cover, striking him in the face. He recoiled with the shock of the blow so that on the next revolution his feet did not go right through the support straps. Instead, he was caught up in the harness by one boot. He kicked at it again but was unable to get free. He was frightened to kick too energetically in case he fouled the lines of the parachute and cradled in his tangled harness like a baby in a stork's bill. Murphy floated gently down towards the stricken town. Once a searchlight passed across him, and for a moment the silk canopy was blinding white. Murphy remembered a childhood prayer and said it aloud. Sweet saw no reason for the engineer to go groveling across the floor in abject panic. Sweet had been in plenty of spins. At elementary flying school it was a mandatory exercise. He didn't worry that the rate of spins was increasing, for he knew that the faster the spin, the more airspeed he had, and therefore the easier it was to regain control. He let the orange spiders come round again. By now they were dancing across the windscreen, and he knew that his dive was almost vertical. Calmly, he put his weight on one side of the rudder bar with both feet. He guessed it would need a lot of muscle, so he jabbed hard. There were no port ailerons and precious little port wing by now. Sweet fell forward, barked his knees and cut his knuckle. "Damn," he said mildly. He knew now beyond a shadow of a doubt that he must get out. The huge aeroplane was spiraling earthwards, its structure rattling and screaming. There were sounds of snapping metal. The altimeter needle was revolving backwards at a frightening speed. His hands were heavy weights that pressed upon his chest, but he managed to remove his torn gloves to get at his harness, and slowly he undid the strap. He checked that his parachute was correctly fastened and decided to get out by the nose hatch. Statistically, the nose hatch was safest. It was bloody silly, but he couldn't get up. He pushed and pulled and wriggled, but he couldn't get up. The force of gravity was pressing him to his seat so that his weight was beyond his strength to lift. There was a weight upon his head that gave him a double chin and made him feel sick. His blood, pressed downward out of his brain, dimmed his vision. Ridiculous. He had so much to live for, fit and handsome. He had a medal, 2 girlfriends, one with a flat in London, a little private income, his shares were doing nicely, promotion due in August. Lots of good friends among the chaps. Why couldn't he get up out of his seat? His vision grew even darker as the increasing gravitational force of the spin drained his brain of its blood. When Lancaster S. Sugar hit Frau Kirsten's farm, it made a crater 30 feet across and in places 8 feet deep. The largest remaining part of it was the tail section that landed 200 yards away. The rear gunner, killed in the initial attack, was still in his turret, which broke off before the impact. The forward part of the fuselage had hit the side wall of the farmhouse and demolished the whole building. Broken bricks and chunks of plaster almost covered torn and scorched paper money and coins that glinted in the light of torches. Saucepans were mixed with altimeters, bedheads with fuel lines, and pieces of Frau Kirsten and her French soldier were intimately mingled with Flight Lieutenant Sweet. There were tattered ailerons, bent flaps. One hot 12-cylinder engine had drawn a scorched furrow across the grass and lopped a tree. Another had turned the cowshed into a butcher's shop. There was a stink of burned oil and hot carbon, and the red-hot metal pieces tinkled like sleigh bells. Among the personal effects found in the wreckage, there were an ivory-handled knife with a cigar-cutting device, a warm bunch of keys, the bomb aimer's left boot, and a torn flying helmet with Murphy written on it in nail varnish. Bodo Reuter and his lorry full of Tenno men arrived on the scene of the crash 15 minutes after it had happened. He organized a search to be sure that no diaries, logbooks or radio equipment had fallen clear of the main impact points. Fuchs Überall and another Tenno man found an RAF flyer tangled into a tree only 150 yards from the crash. He was a burly figure who smiled nervously when challenged. The 2 Tenno men killed him with their spades. When the illuminated glass map had been in use for an hour, the light bulbs, warm varnish and painted metal gave off a smell that mingled with that of floor polish and tense bodies. All Luftwaffe T-huts had this same smell when the air battles were at their peak. The smell, the tension and the glare from the Seeberg table combined to give August Bach a dull headache. It always did. When the raids ended early, or when the bomber stream's return route was over some other sector, he liked to stand outside the door, sniff at the ocean, and let the night breeze refresh his tiredness and the darkness rest his eyes. The red blip turned gently and headed towards Utrecht. That was at the extreme eastern range of this sector. August corrected the fighter's course. "He's getting away," said Willy Reinecker. He followed the light dots with his wax pencil. He had traced a twisting record of inexpert attempts to intercept wherever the 2 lines intertwined. Now the 2 lines were converging once more, and Willy's pencil hovered, trying to will the fighter on to its quarry. "Order, increase speed." "Cat's 8, urged August. In the darkness, Lieutenant Beer was staring ahead, trying to see the target. He glanced enviously to the north where the sky was lighter. If he had them that way, he might be able to see them, but heading eastwards, towards the banks of cumulus that made the horizon ragged and ugly, there was little chance of getting the Tommy silhouetted. If any of those fellows had ever been in an aeroplane at night, they would have more sympathy than this edgy, bad-tempered fool who, just because he could see the red blip clearly upon the table, thought that it must shine clear and visible up here in the sky. It was so lonely here, almost like being at the bottom of the sea with only a distant flicker of light to indicate that the world is awake, or even alive. On the port quarter, there was a battery of 10 searchlights that moved aimlessly, slowly changing their abstract patterns from vertical bars to a grey ghost of a pyramid that even as soon as it was built was demolished and became V's and X's. A lot of help they were. Beer knew that should he wander near those beams, they would try to kill him. On the starboard quarter, 80 miles away, he could see the target being attacked. Distance had drained all colour from the flares and explosions, and from here they were just a steady, flickering grey pinpoint. "He'll never catch him now," said August in a long-suffering voice. "Order, orbit beacon at 6,000 meters. He switched Beer off and connected himself to the red Würzburg operator. "Give me another, Tommy." "Very good, sir. There are still plenty coming." Willi Reinecker had long since taken off his jacket and tie, and now he stretched his arms in great circling movements that relieved the aches in his limbs. With his battered face, shaggy hair and huge shoulders, he looked like a clown acting up for a circus audience, but no one laughed. "Is everything all right, Willi?" Willi nodded, but August knew that all was not well. "There's something wrong?" Anxiously, August looked back at the table and across at the altitude charts. Had he made a fool of himself in front of them all? Had he put that last one in at the wrong altitude and then blamed him for failing to contact? He could see nothing wrong. "Don't act up, Reinecker," said August coldly. He knew that something was wrong, but he would not be made a fool of by a subordinate, not even his second-in-command. Unterfeldwebel Scholl, the senior messenger, a white-haired old man from Innsbruck, was also looking at August in a way that was quite unlike his usual demeanour. Willi tried to pull his fingers off his hands and made loud clicks with their joints. "It's the target," said Willi finally. "The target,
They marked it precisely as far as we know. Although some markers went down over Duisburg, the mist of the Ruhr would make a difference. Perhaps there's a reason, but could there really be? What target? The Tommies are carrying out a precision bombing attack upon Altgarten, sir. Sir. Now he'd said it. That's impossible. An error? Winds wrong? A marker aircraft destroyed? Equipment damaged? Altgarten? The whole stream? I'm afraid so. Herr Oberleutnant. August tried to visualize the scene there, and for a minute he did not speak. Take over the table. Reinecker. Sir. Scholl, tell the telephone switchboard to connect my office phone to this number. Scholl took the scrap of paper but stood for a long time before acting upon the instruction. They both knew that he was giving August plenty of time to change his mind about the call. Such a thing was strictly forbidden. "In your office?" said the messenger finally.
"Yes," said August, "and they must try the other numbers if there's no answer from the first one." "It's a court-martial offence," said Gefreiter Orth, the telephone operator, when he was told to connect the CO to a private phone number in Altgarten, his cunning little eyes glinting as he watched Scholl's reaction. "It had better not be," said Unterfeldwebel Scholl. "I'll fiddle it somehow," said the operator. "I wouldn't drop the old man into the dirt." "You'd better not," said Scholl. "If we lost him, we might get that old bastard from my last station. You'd be sitting there in best uniform, pressed and clean with a cropped head, just in case some high-ranking snooper called by." The telephonist, dressed in vest, shorts and sandals, rubbed his stubbly chin and shuddered at the thought. He looked round at his little sanctum. Pasted upon the wall above the PBX there were a dozen nudes, a pair of baby's shoes, a crucifix, and a warning notice. "Find Hurtmit! Find Hurt!" with a caricature of a big-eared Winston Churchill. Orth was not only the most unsoldier-like man at Ermine, he was its most notorious black marketeer. It was a well-known fact that when Orth hung the enemy listening sign on the door, it meant that the police were tapping the phones for security purposes. Rotterdam, this is Luftwaffe Signals, Ermine. I want a top priority connection to Altgarten. Rhine Province. It's by order of General Christiansen and should not be recorded in the log. If you want details, ask Stabsfeldwebel Braun for a written authority. Yes, I'll wait, but only for a moment. The white-haired Chol bit his lip anxiously. Is he asking this fellow Braun? Orth winked. Braun's one of our people for eggs, he explained. When the phone rang in the cellar, Anna Louisa was half asleep, for the ventilation fans had stopped and the shelter had grown warm and airless. Krefeld Exchange here. Will you take an official call routed via Luftwaffe Signals Rotterdam? Before she could answer, and even amid the crackling of the damaged phone lines, she recognized August's voice. Anna Louisa, are you all right? Perfectly all right. Herr Oberleutnant, said Anna Louisa. She was by now wide awake and guessed that August was running a great risk by calling her. That is, Hans and myself are in the shelter of Herr Voss. Work is going on as usual, she added to make it sound more official. Work, said August. What are you talking about? She had been about to say, the air raid is going on, but we are safe. But she remembered that it was a punishable offence to reveal that a place had been under air attack until 3 days afterwards. She knew too that security officials might be monitoring the call. All is in order, she said. Everything exactly as I promised you this afternoon. It will be as we decided, agreed August, cautious for the same reasons. The noise of Sweet's aeroplane coming across the town at rooftop height was loud enough for Anna Louisa to hear it even in the depths of Voss's cellar. There was a great roar as it struck the ground. It fractured into pieces of metal, each one the size and weight of a motor car, and the pieces bounced across the fields, shaking the ground at each impact. I can't hear you. Herr Oberleutnant. There's a scratching noise and your voice is so faint. It will be as we planned it would. Will what? Nothing, said August. What did you say after planned? You said, it will be as we planned? Then, what did you say? I love you, said August desperately and rang off. Thank God, he said quietly to himself, and he returned to the Seeberg table. We have another, said Willie. August took the microphone and spoke to Beer. Catsi 8, order. Steer 270 for parallel head-on interception. Question, height. Announcing height. 4,500 meters, said Beer. August turned to Willie and 2. When will the Tommy start to lose height? Willie? Any minute, said Willie. This one won't wait for the coast. I feel it. The coloured light stuff is Gilsey Reju airfield. Breeder beyond it, 50 miles to the Dutch coast, with this wind. Say, 16 minutes. I'm going to start losing height, said Lambert. We'll put on a bit of speed if we do that. Kosher leaned forward and arranged Flanagan the cross-eyed doll more comfortably against the windscreen. Can't have Flan falling over, he said. Lambert had been given the doll before his very first operational trip, and it had travelled with him on every sortie. All of the crew firmly believed that to fly without Flanagan would lessen their chances of survival, and Lambert had put him under lock and key between trips, ever since a gunner from A-Flight had borrowed him without asking permission. Lambert noticed that all of the crew would touch the battered doll at some time or other during the trip, although Cohen and Jimmy Grimm would find some rational excuse for doing so rather than admit to being superstitious. Jimmy's wife had darned Flan's foot last month and was making him blue velvet trousers. Kosher returned to his navigation table, and Lambert nosed down gently towards the cloud bank. Billy Reinecker spat loudly upon his hands. August sincerely wished he would not do that, or at least not so loudly, but Reinecker's father had also done so for luck, before starting any job. And in medieval times, it had been a necessary defense against the devil. What chance did August stand of preventing Reinecke from doing it? Anyway, they could do with some luck. From any source available, Willie pressed the soft tip of his wax pencil upon the light blip to begin the trace. For the second time that night, Creaking Door was to begin a journey across Ermine's plotting table. In the shelter, a spellbound Anna Louisa replaced the phone. Softly, she sang her favorite song of the moment. It contained a promise of magic and love. She knew was magic. I know that sometime there will be a miracle, and then 1,000 fairy tales will come true. I know that no love so big and wonderful can pass quickly. We both have the same star, and your fate is also mine. You are far away, and yet so far, because our souls are one. And that is why there will be a miracle sometime, and I know that we'll see each other again. Gerd Bull was an expert in the strange new craft of bombed buildings. He knew that they could be divided into 3 main types. There were the ones that disintegrated into rubble and formed a pyramid of impenetrable debris. Then there were buildings that collapsed only at one side, so that all the floors on that side fell to the ground. The hospital had done that. Then there was this sort of ruin, the most difficult and treacherous of all. The floors had collapsed in the center of the building so that they now formed several V-shapes, jammed one upon the other and waiting for an excuse to settle lower upon a careless rescuer. Gerd knew some of the ways of debris. He knew that a flimsy chair could support several tons of brickwork or lock with another piece of furniture to produce a miraculous cavern in the very center of the wreckage. He knew that gas could collect in airless pockets and be dense enough to ignite a spark or overpower a man who put his head there. He knew the dangers of dripping water, and he knew that a panicky person needed twice the diameter of a careful, calm one, and because of that some rescue crews had been unable to return along their own tunnels. He knew the added strength of curving or crooked tunneling. In short, he was an expert. "No smoking," he told a soldier. There was no one way to tunnel into the heap of debris which covered Voss's cellar. Gerd Bull surveyed the whole heap of it. He peered at the piles of bricks and bits of wood. He lifted doors and mattresses to study the shape of the pile and to decide where the lines of thrust were. The top of the pile was 20 feet above street level and flattened abruptly into a plateau that had a slight bowl of subsidence. Normally he would have begun to dig as close to the ground as possible, but here at the top, an old sofa and kitchen table seemed to form the entrance to a natural cavern through the rubbish. He tested it with his feet, and when only a toy dog and some shattered plaster moved, he decided that it was firm enough to burrow into. He was able to get his whole body inside the wreckage by moving only a few bits of batten and breaking a chair leg and passing it back to the men behind him. "Herr Bull is on his way," he heard a soldier say. He imagined that Anna Louisa would be taking it very calmly. She was a remarkably placid girl. Gerd thought, a schemer or a saint? No. Saint certainly wasn't the word. Often debris provides a natural course for the tunneler, and if possible, he is well advised to use it. Even though he was now crawling at a more shallow angle, he continued to move along the line of least resistance. He was deep inside the pile of debris when he stopped for a moment to listen to it. There were a few creaks and cracks and the shuffle of powdered plaster, but no danger signals. When he was a child, he had had slight claustrophobia. The doctor had told his parents to leave his bedroom door open. He'll grow out of it. Gerd had overcome his fears and was proud of having done so. "Saw," he whispered. Cocking his hand back over his shoulder, he took the handle of it, and working with his elbows against his chest and with the blade moving only 3 or 4 inches, he was able to saw through the bookcase in 10 minutes. Beyond it there were books, and these he could only deal with one by one. Heine, Schiller, The Treasure of Silver Lake by Karl May, Love's Labours Lost, Home Medicine, One Man's Journey Through German West Africa, Memoirs of an Infantry General, Haybox Cooking were all passed back to the Tino who was at his heels, and each permitted Gerd to crawl forward another inch. A pile of gramophone records cracked loudly under his elbow, and a piece of fireplace cut his leg.
"Silence," said Gerd. And the word was repeated back to the men at the entrance to the tunnel, and then a whistle was sounded to tell passers-by to listen for the cries of the buried. But Gerd had been mistaken. Anna Louisa was not crying. She was sitting in an armchair with little Hansel held close to her, rocking him gently and smoothing his hair. He was asleep now. For something of the girl's calm had reassured him. Since she had spoken with August, she had played the musical box a dozen times, examined the Meissen and the silver, and walked round the storehouse until she had seen it all. Now, with the oil lamp flame turned very low, for she knew it would not get light here in the morning, she waited patiently to be rescued. Gerd Boll made excellent progress. Taking under an hour to reach ground level, progress slowed as he went on, for Gerd preferred to jam a piece of wood or brick tightly against the tunnel's roof to hold the wrecked house intact.
When he came back, he would remove his pit props one by one. However, this made passing debris back difficult, and whenever he could, he packed it flat instead. There was still enough room for him to progress through the wreckage by removing only a minimum of obstructions. It was the easiest tunnel he had ever made, almost as if someone else had made it for him. Like an archaeologist, Gerd recognized the compressed layers that had once been stories, through bathroom tiles into stair carpet and on through pieces of kitchen sink. The kitchen floor was stone, and Gerd anticipated a long, hard dig there, but it was simple enough. The flagstones had shattered, and there was a wide pit in the soft earth. Gerd moved through the hole carefully, but still he scraped his shins on the broken stone. He was at an angle of 45 degrees now, with his head downwards, and it was an effort to prevent his legs sliding upon him while his hands were occupied with the blockages in front of him. Twice he did slide forward and had to use all his strength to stretch his legs out behind him to get purchase on the bricks and timber. He was almost into the cellar when he reached the end of his easy tunneling. In front of him there was a green metal barrier. It was 2.5 feet across and circular in shape. It fitted close against the house debris, as the circular door of a safe fits into a wall. Gerd stroked the metal door and wondered what sort of household equipment it could possibly be. A water tank, perhaps, but had ever a water tank been as sturdily made as this? Thick steel, fixed together with massive bolts that could... A bomb. My God. Gerd decided that it was the end of a medium-capacity bomb. A 6-foot steel canister that had been dropped, set for long delay with a celluloid heart full of acid eating its way through to detonate the amatol. It had dropped upon the wreckage and torn a passage through the rubble, which was why Gerd had found the natural path so easy to move along. He'd followed the bomb. Long delay. But how long? 1 minute, 2 minutes, 24 hours. Gerd went hot and cold and could hear his heart beating like a drum. A 1,000 B cookie would obliterate half the street, and he was cuddling it. He felt the bomb and fancied that it was hot, although he knew it was probably the temperature of his nervous hands that deceived him. He thought he could detect the sharp odor of British paint and varnish that he'd smelled on other RAF bombs. From now on, he was tunneling in earnest. He worked along the side of the metal, using the strength of the canister to support one side of his tunnel and building bits of broken stone and wood from it where necessary. It seemed as though his trip past the cookie would never end. He moved past the smooth steel shape and was 6 feet lower at the far end of it. Suddenly, a piece of bedstead gave way under his elbow, the cellar wall buckled and collapsed, and he found himself sliding forward into space. He fell because With remarkable self-discipline, he refrained from grasping at the bomb to steady himself. He landed heavily. "Herr Böll," said Anna Louisa, opening her eyes to find the agile little man crouching on the wet floor. Having appeared with the suddenness of a demon king in a pantomime, he was covered in brick dust and rubbing a sore elbow. "That's a bomb," he said, awkwardly pointing at the dark, smooth shape that was only just visible through the gap in the cellar ceiling. "It looks like a water tank," said Anna Louisa. She came closer to stare at the metal shape. "No, I think it's a bomb," said Gerd Böll. But now he had an uneasy suspicion that she was right. He smiled awkwardly at her and then asked, "Did you get the ring?" "Yes," she said. "It's in my handbag. Do you want to see it?" "I think we better try and get you out," he said. "I love Herr Bach." She took the oil lamp and turned the wick on full, and Gerd shone his torch too. "It's thicker than any water tank I've ever seen. Herr Bach's hot water tank in the apartment in Krefeld was just like that. Have you got everything? There are some wonderful treasures here. Herr Böll, did you know that Herr Voss had such wonderful things?" Gerd switched off his torch. There were lots of things he hadn't known before, he thought, like young Anna Louisa having false teeth. Perhaps she'd forgotten that she hadn't put them in. He tried to think of some way of reminding her without causing embarrassment. "Voss is a wealthy man," he said. "I like him," said Anna Louisa. "We might be dead now if he hadn't made us take shelter." "I'll help you climb up to the tunnel," said Gerd, shifting an armchair upon which she could climb. "Leave the child. It will be easier for me to bring him. I've done it before. I'm glad it was you who came. Herr Böll." "Why?" "I always had the feeling that you disliked me." "I don't dislike you," said Gerd, blushing. "About the marriage I'm not so sure, but I don't dislike you. But I would make Herr Bach a good wife. Herr Böll, I promise you, I promise you." The intensity of the girl's words and the simplicity of her emotions showed Gerd a side of her he never knew existed. He patted her arm awkwardly and feared she would weep. He wanted to tell her about the letter he'd written. So that she would not see his face, he picked up the child. "I promise," said Anna Louisa again. And suddenly, Gerd was happy for the two of them. He knew that his letter would have no effect upon two people really in love. It was August who'd been right. What did it matter what the girl had done or had been? The chances of happiness were too rare and too fleeting to be put under a microscope. He himself had been a rake in his young days, and yet that had not prevented him becoming a loyal and loving husband. Why should it not be true of this girl, A.C. MacDonald, RAF armourer, whose father now sat in a Dundee kitchen with 3 cups of untouched cold tea at his elbow and the telegram still in his hand, had done his last day's work well? He had fitted the Type 47 pistol that morning, and the celluloid was of one of the thinnest types used. As the bomb had left Lambert's bomb bay, a linen cord, still attached to the plane, had dragged the safety device from the pistol and rotated a pulley which screwed down a bolt upon a tiny bottle of acid. Now the acid had eaten through the celluloid until the spring-loaded striking pin had nothing left to restrain it. The pin struck the detonator, and 600 pounds of explosive destroyed the cellar and was heard across the whole town of Altgarten. 2 houses were totally destroyed and 4 severely damaged. 5 people were injured, since by the time it exploded they had heard the all clear and come back to their houses. Other delay bombs had been roped off, but no one knew of this one. 7 Tenno men, 3 policemen and Storp, the old blockwart from number 29, who was still digging down towards his wife, were blown to pieces, Vicky, and a wristwatch belonging to one of the Tennos was found 4 streets away. No recognizable part or possession or garment of Gerd Böll, Anna Louisa or Hansel was ever found. although even today splinters of mycen and shapeless blobs of silver turn up in the gardens there. One of the difficulties that the rescue workers faced was in the removal of dead and injured. Many bodies were glued to the road surface by the heat and were impossible to move without special equipment. The body of the burgomaster's wife, for instance, held up traffic on Neringstrasse for 2 hours. Near the cinema, a rescue team of 10 men were burrowing deep into a pile of debris. A whistle blew. "Quiet, everyone!" There was still a lot of noise, but every head cocked towards the rubble, listening for a call or groan. "Stretcher party!" shouted an NCO. "Wonderful," said a policeman. "There are 38 people buried under that lot." "Morphia!" shouted the NCO. Quickly, the first light of dawn revealed deep craters in the streets and pavements, littered with furniture salvaged from nearby houses. On a piece of brickwork among the remains of Neringstrasse 39 there was a chalked message. "Kurt, I am with Frau Weber. Love, Kate." Soon there were hundreds of such messages as the people of the town tried to reform themselves into groups. "News of Herr Stroop, please." "Otto is dead." "Peter is on leave." "Mother, stay here" were written alongside the bolder notes for rescuemen. 9 dead in rear part of cellar. 2 dead first floor back room. Danger gas sump. Quicklime, danger. The radar plotting room was quiet enough to hear the electric clock jump each second. "This fellow's a dud," said Willi Reinecker. "Keep the other aircraft up close, and if this one makes a mess of this interception, we'll not give him a second chance." On the Seeberg table, the 2 men watched the dots crawling towards the coast. Both August Bach and his NCO had removed their jackets, but in the heat of the plotting room their shirts showed patches of perspiration as the night wore on. It wasn't pleasant to see the destruction of a town happen before your very eyes, even if it was only represented by electronic dots. Willie picked up the glass of tea that had gone tepid. He drank without noticing that he did so. All the time, the wax pencil in his left hand traced the moving dots across the table. "He'll mess it up," said Willi Reinecker. It was all right for the others, thought Lieutenant Beer. They all regarded flying as a mystical experience. For some of them, there was nothing in life more important than becoming expert at controlling these uncertain flying machines. Beer, a motor racing driver, had gone to his medical examination hoping to become a transport official or an administrative officer. The doctors had classed him fit for aircrew. The aptitude and intelligence tests showed suitable ratings, and so he had found himself posted to the AB School for Pilot Training. It was typical of the arrogance he'd met in the Luftwaffe that they all assumed he'd be grateful for the chance to fly. Carefully, he followed every instruction given by the controller at Ermine, but he could tell the man was irritable. Prussian arrogance. Beer was from Regensburg. His father and his family as far back as the Holy Roman Empire were Bavarian. To them all the so-called Germans outside the frontiers were Prussian. Bavarians were political animals, like the Austrians. And like the Austrians, the world had labelled them gemütliche peasants and simple-minded clowns. Beer resented that. Over his earphones came the voice of August Bach. "Order? Hold it! Announcement! Impossible!" said Beer. "Give it some flap." "Man," said August, abandoning procedure. "You won't stall." "Nor will you," thought Beer, "in your cosy control hut." But he throttled back and put down more flap, although now he felt he must watch the airspeed needle very carefully. Beer's radar man made contact. "He's ahead of us and slightly below." Beer eased the antlers forward a fraction. Kettle drums," said Beer. "The man's a genius," said Willie. He put down his pencil. "No, sir," called Beer's radar man desperately. "Much too much. I'll lose him off the top of the screen in a moment." The observer had his binoculars to his eyes. "There he is." Beer cupped his hand against the perspex to block off the reflections of the instrument panel lights. but his movement tilted the control column and they banked. He sat well back in his seat and brought the controls to normal. "Still too far to port," said the radar man. "He's very close. You should see him." "I can still see him," said the observer. "Port and high?" asked the radar man. "Yes." Beer still couldn't see it, but he cocked the guns anyway. The compressed air gave a hiss of anticipation. "Too fast again?" said the observer. "Yes," agreed the radar operator from the back seat. Damn them, they showed no respect for his rank. They spoke together as if he were superfluous. He put the nose up a trifle and watched the airspeed needle dip. But now the variometer was edging up to show that they were climbing. This business of matching speed with the target was not only the most difficult, but also the most dangerous. "He's turning left. He must have seen us." "Me? No, just correcting course." "Stop talking so much," snapped Beer. "I'm in command." The observer looked at Beer with cold disdain. The NCOs called him the cyclist because in the physical manner of a cyclist, he trod upon his subordinates while nodding deferentially to his superiors. He wondered if Beer knew of his nickname and glanced at him again. But Beer didn't notice. He was staring ahead, trying to see the Tommy. Beer stared into the windscreen, but could see only a pink, sweaty face staring back at him. He could smell stale smoke in his nostrils. Damn that firefighting bastard too. At first he could see only the reflections of the instruments. Then two flickers of light detached themselves, and he knew that he was looking at the exhausts of an RAF Lancaster. "We're right on top of him," said Beer, staring down at the airspeed needle that was so close to stalling point. Perhaps he should increase speed. Christ. The slipstream threw the junkers aside and almost wrenched the controls away from him. Quickly, Beer recovered control. "We must get closer than this," said the observer, with a calm insolence. Beer reached for the throttles but changed his mind. He did not increase speed. He knew what a mid-air collision would mean. A giant like that would chop them into fragments and not even feel the bump. "Much closer," said the observer. There was a note of admonition in his voice. Damned Prussian, Beer was the captain of this aircraft. Even if the target did not reach the edges of his gun sight, it was plumb in the center. This was close enough. The Lancaster seemed gigantic and very near. "Horrido!" he called and pressed the gun button. He was yawing slightly, so the target slid to one side of the gun sight. He corrected with a touch of rudder. Not too much, he warned himself. "Watch your airspeed." The WWII was a fine aeroplane, a gentleman's machine, one that would fly hands off and respond gently and positively to the pilot, yet it would not turn without plenty of rudder. Beer did not give enough and, as he tried to follow the Lancaster's turn. The junkers slid sideways and Beer only recovered by means of a sudden burst of power that put his nose up. Flash Gordon saw him because he was coming in high enough to be on the skyline. He saw the whole shape of Beer's junkers pass across a piece of moonlit cloud. He had told Lambert, and now the whole crew waited while these two pilots matched skills. And luck. "He's a real expert," said Flash. "You can tell by the way he's waiting out there." "Scared shitless," said Binty, who was also watching him, but his voice lacked conviction. "Keep off the air," said Lambert. "Flash, give me his ranges. 1,500 yards, beginning to close now." His voice changed to a more urgent note. 1,200. For an instant, both gunners saw the junkers as the moonlight struck the propellers and made them shine like a pair of spectacles in candlelight. Closing fast now. Then, from between the glassy discs, there came white blobs that stretched and ran like spilt mercury. "He's firing," said Flash. "Corkscrew port," said Binty. Their voices muddled together on the intercom. Lambert didn't corkscrew. He kicked the rudder bar and pulled both starboard throttles fully back. The Lancaster twisted abruptly to the right and jerked almost to a stop. Lambert prayed, but also fearfully waited for the impact. Beer's junkers came over them, still firing, with only 20 feet between the tips of its propeller blades and the top of the Lancaster's rudders. The roar of it made the Lancaster's metal body sing with the vibration. Afterwards, there was a kick of prop wash. "See him go?" "Skip," said Binty gleefully from the top turret. Lambert was too busy to answer. Battersby was not looking out of the window. He had watched Lambert's hands. It was the epitome of all he had been taught never to do. In theory, creaking door should now have its tail ripped off. Battersby's hand reached out to the throttles as soon as Lambert's left them. Lambert nodded, and with relief Battersby put the starboard engines back to cruising power. The Lancaster was sliding sideways, like a sycamore seed. The compass went spinning as the nose moved right round the horizon and past their original heading. The nose was inching upwards. The airspeed needle dropped towards stalling speed, and Battersby could see that the controls were mushy. Battersby watched the needle as Lambert pushed the stick well forward to put the nose down. The needle hovered at 160 mayamore, the aeroplane pulsating as it lost its airworthiness. Grudgingly, the nose dropped and the needle started a return journey. Lambert spared a hand for his microphone. "Rear gunner, is the tail assembly okay?" It didn't half bend. "Skip. Okay now?" "Looks okay." "Happy, engineer?" "Yes." "Skipper, but at the HCU, they told us never to do that or the tail would come off. Not unless you give her too much rudder. Remember that." "I will, Skipper," said Battersby. "Any signs of the night fighter? Anyone?" "We've lost him, I think," said Digby. "Nice work." "Skipper." "Bloody marvellous," said Binty. "You should have seen the bastard go. He was 1,000 yards off to port and still firing." Beer was still firing long after the target had almost magically stopped in mid-air and sped off under his starboard wing. Now there was just the sound of the motors and the airstream. Beer's clothes squelched with sweat. They had only missed a mid-air collision by a few feet. "I think we hit him," said Beer. "No, Herr Leutnant. I saw the cannon shells hitting him." There was no reply. Beer wanted a victory. He said, "There were flashes. You saw them. Your ammunition destroying itself at 800 meters more. I saw them. Son of a stand-up." Sawdust on the floor, WWII owner in a sleazy part of Nuremberg. How could you shoot down a real flyer? The observer had been washed out of AB school with flying better than Beer's best attempts. He found it difficult to hide his contempt for this Bavarian peasant in officer's uniform. So did Willy Reinecker. "Messed it up," he said. "The stupid Schlemiel." The two blips had merged, and when they separated again, it was hard to know which was which. "The Tommy is still going northwest," said August. "He's 30 kilometers from the main stream now. He's making sure that the night fighter doesn't get a visual. Shall I call him?" "Leave him," said August. "Call the other fellow in." "The Tommy's coming a long way north of the stream, sir." "Shaken up a bit." "Faulty compass?" "Could be. He must be here. Almost overhead. He'll turn." "Yes." "There he goes." "Nee. Bring in Katzer 1, WWII." Victor von Löwenherz looked at his wristwatch. He didn't trust the cockpit clock. The ground crews were not careful enough with them. He switched over to his main fuel tank and set the mixture to weak. He might need every last drop of fuel. For the Tommies entering his sector now would take another hour to return through it on the return journey. The last few bombers would be the most vulnerable ones. It was a simple matter of natural selection. The best pilots got promotion and the best aircraft. The best pilots would get the best navigators and would lead the attack. The least skilled pilots lagged behind, missed landfalls, lost their way, muddled their radio signals and had equipment faults that their careless pre-flight checks had not revealed. Sometimes such planes never found the target. Long after the main force had gone home, they would be wandering alone over some remote, heavily defended area, presenting a keen Würzburg operator and controller with their only target of the night. If they did get to the target, they arrived last, when the defenses were fully alert and the night fighters airborne with night vision adjusted. These crews got the planes that were slowest and the ones that could not climb. They were vulnerable targets, and Löwenherz wanted to be quite sure that he was in the air when they arrived in this sector. For Löwenherz was still in his assigned sector, right over the beacon. Other pilots, like Himmel and even Redenbacher, had disobeyed the standing orders and followed the bomber stream along its route to the target. Löwenherz had not done that. He had patrolled his sector and obeyed implicitly the orders of his controller, August Bach. Now Bach called him and told him that he had a 4-motor Tommy. Announcement: a big car. Order: steer 300 degrees. That's clear, said Löwenherz. He increased his speed to overtake the Tommy before he was out of the radar range of his sector. On the anti-aircraft cruiser, held Admiral Paulak and his K-3 had had an eventful night of the sort that Paulak had predicted. Now he reminded his friend of his prediction for the 8th time that evening. From the moon-rimmed cumulus to the southeast came the sound of a plane. Then other planes. From the southeast, said Paulak. Why from the south? Night fighter. Looks like it. He's firing. He's got him. Got him? Scorned Paulak. Lost him. You mean? He danced a little mime in which he threw a shell upon the loading tray, swung the rammer, spun the elevation wheel and the traverse and fired the gun. Klaus watched him dolefully. The alarm buzzer made them rush back into their turret. Paulak banged his elbow on the balancing spring cover. Klaus smiled to himself. In the 55 minutes that it had taken Lambert to fly from the German convoy 100 miles to the target and back again, the convoy had sailed only 9 nautical miles along the coast, although the Held had done a little more than that, for it was now a mile ahead of the convoy instead of at its very rear. Lambert's evasive movements had brought him well north of the flight plan. Not even the edge of the bomber stream passed over Scheveningen, so the only blip on the Held's Würzburg was creaking door, until Löwenherz came creeping up behind them. Fire! It was radar-controlled firing, and 12 of the guns were 10.5s like the one that Paulak manned. The explosions made a straight-line pattern of stars in the air. The radar computer purred smoothly as it corrected the sighting so that the next salvo would compensate for the speed of the aircraft. The pointer moved, and the gunners followed it. The guns fired in salvos, so it was no advantage that Paulak loaded at almost twice the speed of all the others. He waited. Paulak only did it to demonstrate to his friend Klaus Munter the way he wanted the loading done in future. That no better rate of fire was achieved by Paulak's haste made the accident especially tragic. There was little for the naval surgeon to do. That damned breech has made as neat a job of amputation as I ever saw. He clipped the veins and sewed up the wrist as best he could and let Paulak sink into a deep, morphia-induced sleep. Klaus Munter would not open the breech. The lieutenant in charge was about to insist that Munter did it, but finally relented and did it himself. When they did open it, the unused shell was difficult to remove. It was glued into the mechanism by an unrecognizable substance like raspberry jam. Radar-controlled flak always bursts in patterns, 1 burst for each gun in the battery. Some RAF crews remained calm enough to make notes of the flashes for the intelligence officer. This salvo was well spaced on a southeasterly axis. The next one was even better, and the third was the most accurate of all. Whether using radar or visual sighting, the aiming of an anti-aircraft gun is a complex skill. Both Lambert and Löwenherz were traveling at 240 mph, which required the shells to be aimed at a spot nearly 1.5 miles ahead of them. Before each shot, the fuse had to be set accurately, and even if the target's course remained constant, the range kept changing with the angle of the gun. The rearmost shell of this salvo exploded 71 feet from Löwenherz's port motor. The theoretical lethal radius of an exploding 10.5 centimeter shell was 50 feet. This one fragmented into 4,173 pieces, of which 12 weighed over 1 ounce. 1,125 weighed between 1 ounce and a 50th of an ounce, and 3,036 were fragments of less than a 50th of an ounce. 28 fragments hit Löwenhertz's junkers. 4 pieces penetrated the port motor, and others went into the wing and fuselage. The antlers were wrenched out of his hands as the ailerons were torn and buffeted by the shockwave. The port motor's oil pressure and boost dropped. Then the oil temperature shot out of its marked place and swept clockwise. The motor was losing oil rapidly. Mrozek could see it escaping into the air, looking not dark and turbid, but white and sugary. Löwenhertz put the nose down and closed the fuel cock. Then he gave the port motor a burst of throttle to use up the last of the fuel and thus lessen the fire risk. Feather the prop, ignition off, extinguisher on. He'd done the whole thing while subconsciously remembering the positions of neighboring airfields. None was very near. Valkenburg, the nearest, was right under the stream. He didn't fancy that. In the moonlight ahead, he saw the complex pattern of the islands and estuaries of Zeeland, where outfalls of the great rivers of Europe fought a meandering battle with the low, flat lands of Holland. He recognized this coast. He'd done many forced landings here, in nightmares, just before he awoke. Dump the fuel. He pulled the top off the emergency box beside his seat. The fuel came out of his tail, like a fine silvery feather 50 feet long, glistening in the cold moonlight. He closed the cooling gills on the failed motor and gave the good motor a trifle more power. Then he changed the trim to keep her nose high. It was exactly like the emergency instructions in the instruction manual, except that the author of that manual had never flown on one motor in a plane with radar aerials stuck into the nose like a toasting fork. He watched the turn and bank indicator and saw that the junkers was flying lopsided. It was sinking at 5 meters a second according to the variometer, and he couldn't lessen the rate of descent. The altimeter crawled backwards. "Strap tight," said Löwenhertz to his white-faced crew. The WWII was not an easy aircraft to force land on one motor. They had all watched one burst into flame at the end of Kroonstyk's main runway only 7 weeks ago. Löwenhertz looked at the man beside him. Not a word was exchanged. But Löwenhertz was convinced by the look. "Bail out." Mrozek wrestled with the floor hatch, but it had been damaged and would not open. He looked up at Löwenhertz in desperation. Löwenhertz detached the rear part of the cockpit cover, and it flew off with a terrible roar that left them in an icy gale that whined and hissed across the edges of the windscreen. It spoiled the trim, so he touched the wheel to bring the nose down. Mrozek went first. Carefully, he tucked his Zeiss binoculars inside his tunic. Lost in action, he would not be asked to account for them. Agile as ever, he climbed out through the top like an acrobat. One of his boots swung dangerously near to Löwenhertz's head. Then he had wriggled clear. At first it seemed a perfect job, but a nasty thump told them that the slipstream had batted him back against the plane's tail. The slipstream threw him forward so that the binoculars crushed his ribcage and broke 4 ribs. Tumbling head over heels, his wrist struck the leading edge of the port tailplane, and the fin gave his head a glancing blow before he was sucked away in a slipstream of fuel spraying from the jettison pipe. Overcome by the fuel and the blow on his head, Mrozek fell 3,000 feet. Then night air, blowing across his soaked clothing, refrigerated him. Without fully regaining consciousness, he pulled the ripcord and floated down under his canopy safely into a potato field. Sachs had always been a bit timid. Löwenhertz had seen his papers and knew that the pilot section and officer candidate board had both failed him because of this. Löwenhertz decided that he would need more than just an order, especially to use the top escape exit. If you don't go immediately, I'm going to jump and leave the aeroplane to you." Sachs climbed out then, armed with the sort of luck that life had always provided for this rich young radar man. He was carried well clear and made a perfect descent. The first sharp pang that Löwenherz had felt at the moment of the explosion had by now become a dull, wet ache. It was as though an uncomfortably hot barber's towel had been pressed against his belly and wrapped around his middle. Its cause was a broken fragment of a knurled brass pin from the flak shell's nose cone fuse. The pin had punched a tiny hole in the stressed metal skin of the aircraft's nose and split into 3 parts after hitting the gyro compass. This piece, weighing only 1/60th of an ounce, entered Löwenherz's belly when it passed through the abdominal wall and the peritoneal cavity, puncturing his ascending colon. It began to tumble as it lost speed, chewing its way through small arteries and a kidney before cracking open one of his lumbar vertebrae. There it nestled against his spinal cord, compressing it slowly. It was not easy to hold the starboard wing down now that the motor had failed on that side, and it was buffeting fiercely under his hands because of the damage to the metal wings and the tattered fabric of the ailerons themselves. Löwenherz smiled grimly to himself. It was the very devil of a predicament. When he throttled back, he began to lose height immediately. Yet with the good motor on full throttle to maintain height, it carried him round in huge circles. No matter how much he tried to correct the turn with the ailerons, it made little or no difference. The Ju-88s were all like this, and they needed a lot of rudder to turn them, and Löwenherz couldn't even feel his feet, let alone use them upon the rudder bar. He pressed a hand upon his left knee to use his lower leg as one might use a stick to prod at the rudder, but the pain on his spine was terrible. He continued to do it until the moment when he almost blacked out. He called up the controller and told him briefly that he'd been hit and wounded and was heading due west over one of the great islands south of Rotterdam. "Get out! Katze 1, called August Bach urgently. "Announcement! Impossible!" said Löwenherz. "I've damaged my back." "Order, turn back. Losing height too fast." "These damned aerials." "Order, keep the radio on," said August. "We've switched the emergency service into the circuit. They'll take a fix on you for the rescue boats. The Würzburg will hold you too." "Thank you," said Löwenherz. The life had drained from Löwenherz's lower limbs so that only the upper part of him was truly alive. His vision was affected too. The red and green lights on his panel and the bright blue moonlight became a neutral grey. The noise of the one good engine seemed quieter, and he wondered if that was why it could not hold the heavy junkers in the air. The grey aeroplane descended down to the grey ocean, and the flash it made as it hit the waves was grey, like the water into which it sank. Sadly, the Würzburg at Ermin followed the Junkers out over the ocean until the blip became a phosphorescent glow that died away. The tube was blank, except for a rain of interference. When the great red flash appeared far out across the dark water, a sentry phoned the control room to tell them. "He's gone," said Willy. "The sentry saw the explosion. It's always the best ones we lose." "It was the Staffelkapitän," said Willy. "I know his voice. One of the best pilots we worked with."
He was a count or a baron. Damn bad luck. That bloody flak ship. There was no way they could know. Willy, they're probably painting a ring round one of the guns.
Probably. Each of Creaking Door's encounters with night fighters had lasted only a few seconds, but between those encounters had come the tension and tiring concentration of 100 miles of cross-country instrument flying. After he had evaded Beer by the sudden turn to starboard, Lambert continued on, nervously examining every quarter of the sky, but soon it was clear that they had escaped from that attack. Binty Jones said, "Skip, can Jimmy give me a break? I've got a touch of cramp." "Okay with you about Jimmy?" Lambert said. "Okay, Skip. Quickly. Then..." Lambert felt the trim change as first the wireless operator went back to the upper turret and then Binti climbed down from his seat in the roof and moved farther back to the Elsan just ahead of the tail. Jimmy Grimm, like most of the wireless operators, was a trained air gunner, and he enjoyed the view that the turret afforded him. He touched the grips and the turret turned obediently, the machine guns tilting at the merest finger touch. One of the worst aspects of the wireless operator's job was the heated air outlet that emerged near his seat. Even wearing the minimum of flying kit, Jimmy had become uncomfortably hot. He slipped one side of his helmet off and pressed his face against the ice-cold perspex of the turret. It was like a long draught of cold beer. "Okay, Jimmy." "Okay, Skip." Lambert saw the flicker of the navigator's light as his curtain was pushed aside and guessed that Binti had come forward to the cockpit for a moment. Binti cherished a conviction that flying a bomber was little different from driving a motorcycle, and he liked to watch Lambert's activities and tried to commit them to memory. He noticed that the altimeter was steadily turning as they lost height. It was the usual procedure to exchange height for speed from the time the enemy coast was crossed on the return journey. "What about that photo flash, Binti? See if you can push it out, will you? Can someone give me a hand?" "Skipper?" "No," said Lambert. "I'll give a hand." "Skipper," offered Cohen. "Okay," said Lambert. "See what you can do." The moonlight that revealed the bombers to the night fighters was also reassuring to an alert bomber crew. Löwenherz was still dancing through the puffy cumulus far behind them over Rotterdam, and no one in Creaking Door was aware of his existence. Lieutenant Beer had been assigned to a southern part of the Ermin sector. In short, there was not an enemy in sight. Over the ocean, one would not expect an 8.8 centimeter flak gun, but even if by some magic one was there, Creaking Door was nearly 3,000 feet higher than the effective range of an 8.8 centimeter flak gun. Lambert was relating these facts to himself when a 10.5 centimeter shell with its superior range burst near Creaking Door's tailplane. It came from the tail, a strangled thump, a giant's belch that rumbled along the metal throat of stringers and formers. Then came the bad breath of cordite and burning, speeding on the wave of displaced air that pushed Lambert forward against the controls, shook the extinguishers loose, and sent Kosh's charts to fill the cockpit with fluttering paper. There was a flash of light, too. That came from inside the fuselage. It made the screen turn white and blinded Lambert, whose eyes were adjusted to the dark night. The control column came to meet Lambert's belly, and even with all his strength, he could not prevent it coming. Door's nose reared up like a frightened horse, and the sound of the motors changed to a new note of anxiety. "Mickey," said Lambert. "Mickey!" And Battersby rushed to his assistance, for he knew that he was the one that was needed. Binti Jones had been thrown to the floor by the explosion. As he picked himself up, he knew that Door had been mortally hit. Then there was another great flash, bigger than any flak shell, a great white, soundless explosion right under Door's belly. "Take a look, Binti," said Lambert. "Back there." Binti got to his feet while Battersby put his foot on the pilot's seat supports and pressed against the column as hard as he could. His face was beetroot red, and the veins on his forehead shiny with exertion. The controls remained unyielding, although, with little Battersby there to push, Lambert was able to hold them still. Lambert checked the other controls. The rudder bar was slopping from side to side, and the trimmer wheels did not respond. The elevators were unmovable, and all the time the aircraft's nose was trying to come up. Both of them were using a lot of energy, and Lambert doubted whether they could fight the column forward for the whole trip across the North Sea. Binti pushed the navigator's curtain aside and was met by a blinding green light. It was so unnatural that he crossed himself and wondered if they had entered hell as a crew. The green light flickered and died. Suddenly it was pitch dark, and there was a stench of burning cordite and rags. Binti Jones edged aft through the darkness. He groped towards Kosher's seat, but he was not there. He continued climbing up over the main spar and past the bunk. The interior of the plane was billowing with smoke. Cautiously, he stepped into it and walked as far as his turret before he saw the hole in the fuselage. He knew that the metal skin was thin and that a blow with a pencil's end could drive a hole right through it, but that did not lessen the shock of seeing a gap big enough to drive a small car through. Because the explosion had broken a section of metal skin away from its rivets and bent it back upon itself, the hole was rectangular. The metal rattled angrily in the airstream like a monstrous letterbox flap. For a moment there was less smoke, and Binti saw through the hole. There were tripods of grey searchlight beams somewhere near Rotterdam to the east of them, but the Lancaster was turning and the searchlights passed and the smoke closed in again. "Jesus," said Binti. He expected a reply from Jimmy Grimm in the turret, but when he looked up he found that only the upper half of Jimmy remained. The leather-jacketed torso and masked head was staring over the gun sights as though ready to open fire, but the lower part of him was not there. There was just a boggy puddle of bone splinters. Blood and liquidized viscera dumped on the floor and dripping from the flare stowage. Into it was pumping oil from the fractured pipes that led to the rear turret. Binti flashed his torch away from the obscene sight and steadied himself against the ice-cold metal skin of the fuselage. Lambert had no rudder to steer with. Experimentally, he held the control column and gently turned it sideways to operate the ailerons without letting it back an inch. For what seemed a long time, Dorr didn't respond. The fabric covering on the starboard aileron was so tattered that most of the slipstream was whistling through the holes. The port aileron was spoiling the lift on that wing, but the starboard one was not giving extra lift to starboard. Dorr settled down like a fitfully sleeping dog and dropped 50 feet with a cranium-pressing lurch that pinned everyone to the floor. When she staggered across the sky, Lambert feared the tail had broken, but slowly the starboard wing came up. Inch by inch it came until it cut into the moonlit clouds. Then the nose began to slide sideways and ran gently along the horizon, and the compass moved slowly until it pointed the way to England. Lambert knew that they had suffered severe structural damage at the rear. He wondered how much warning they would get if the airstream got busy and tried to rip the back end off. Already the drag was such that he could feel the rear part of the aircraft sagging and bucketing. He reduced speed, throttling back to minimize the strain upon the airframe. Binti plugged into the intercom. "Are you there? Flash?" There was no reply. "It's Binti, boy. Are you there, kiddo?" Binti moved gingerly nearer to the gaping holes. Through them he could even see a ragged moon glinting on the black ocean. The floor creaked and tilted under him, and nervously he stepped back. There were only a dozen stringers, an ammunition runway, and that piece of metal floor plate holding creaking Dorr's tail on. Binti's weight might be the last straw. "Binti, what's happening there? Jimmy's had it, Skip, and I can't get no answer from Flash. Can't you open his turret doors? Can't get as far as that, Skip. She's full of smoke. There's half the bloody fuselage side gone. Her tail's hanging on by its teeth. Kosher?" For the first time, Binti thought of Kosher. He seemed to have disappeared. "Kosher, you all right?" said Lambert over the intercom. There was an answering noise. "Where are you?" said Lambert. The intercom gave only a monosyllabic grunt. "You hurt?" Again a bubbling sound came over the wires. Mother, perhaps. They never said father. Mutti? Yes. It could be Mutti. Lambert had carried dead and injured before. In 1941 he'd brought a Whitley 250 miles with everyone, except himself, dead or semi-conscious. By now he knew the signs. The silent ones were either dead or unharmed. The screamers were slightly injured and scared, for no one who was mortally torn could spare the stamina for a long, loud scream. It was the soft groans that needed tourniquets and morphine. Voices like Cohen's. "Find Kosher." "Bint, I've found him. Skip, is he okay?" "No." A silence. "You'll have to lose altitude. Skip, he needs oxygen." "He..."
Connect his tube. Tube's okay. He's got no oxygen mask on. Put it on. Can't. Skip. It's gone. What do you mean gone? Burned away. Skipper, I'm going to have to get the morphine from the box. Binti went to the rear. This time he stepped lightly and leaned well towards the least damaged side. He tried not to look down into the clouds and see below, and tried to lose weight by willpower. How much of this tube of morphine do I put into him? Give him half a tube into the arm. That's still a double dose. It's difficult. Skip. I can't tell which is arm. Will the leg be okay? Okay. Binti? Digby? Go back and give Binti a hand. Will you? To say that Binti was not a close friend of Kosher Cohen would be an understatement. The two men had so little in common that the overtures of friendship that Kosher had made to the Welshman merely underlined the differences of class, education, and interests. Binti had spent his childhood in a children's home and his youth at an RAF school for apprentices. He had always been shouted at and punished frequently, and his life had run according to timetables and rulebooks. Little that was worth having came Binti's way, and when it did, he grabbed for it without worrying who got the elbow. Cohen had been educated at public school and university. Also, formalistic, male-dominated societies. But their rituals had ill-prepared him for conversation with men like Binti, who was truly knowledgeable only about crumpet and motorcycles. Cohen spoke like an officer, a fact that prevented Binti and others from being able to confide to him their inadequacies. "Here, Cohen. Want a lift to London?" Grrr. Binti jangled a bunch of door keys. Last time I dropped in on my London piece by surprise, she was in the bath. Took me the whole weekend to get my uniform dry. Thanks, Binti, but some of the fellows from school are climbing this weekend. I said I'd go along. Binti flashed the torch around the bare metal interior, racks of signal flares, a first aid box, and the curve of the ammunition runways that sloped gently all the way to the rear turret. 10 feet ahead of him were the remains of his mid-upper turret, bent and bloody. There were no flames, but now and again there was the crackle of a bullet exploding with the heat. I say, what good luck running into you. Binti, would you like to come down to my parents' place this weekend? Not unless there'll be spare crumpet there. Binti tried to pull Cohen forward to the crew bunk built over the main spar, but Cohen was glued to the flare chute by cooked flesh. Binti was frightened that he might pull Cohen apart, for now, with the morphia in him, he would feel no pain until it was too late. When the flak shell exploded, Kosher had been trying to dislodge the photo flash from the bent chute. He had recovered his balance quickly, grabbed a fire extinguisher, and hurried back towards the fire. A parachute was smouldering. It filled the fuselage with the black fumes of burning cloth. Some 303 bullets overheated and popped, making clinks and whines as they ricocheted around the metal structure. Very pistol signals, Chediao, cartridges and other pyrotechnics caught fire, filling the narrow corridor with blinding light. Bright greens and reds lit up inside the smoke of a wind drift flare. Some of them burned through the metal skin and fell gently to the sea. Jimmy Grimm was past aid. Oh, God. His torch was stabbing at the smoke and the lights exploding as Cohen looked back to the great multi-million candle power photo flash that he had been trying to dislodge from the damaged chute. It was smouldering. There was no one to help him and no one to appeal to. There was only one way to eject it from the aircraft, and that was down the flare chute.
He pushed at it with the new energy of desperation and dislodged it just a fraction of a second before it exploded. That was the soundless white explosion that had puzzled Lambert. Perhaps if Kosher had been wearing his heavy leather aircrew gauntlets, he would have been less burned, but, like most navigators, he wore only his silk linings. Having found it impossible to draw pencil lines and turn the circular slide rule while wearing thick gloves, and if only he had not looked down the flare chute to see what he was doing. Binti cuddled the boy closely. After he had put the quarter of a grain of morphia into him, Kosher began to shake like a man in a fit. But then he became still again. Kosher's eyes remained open but went glassy like a toy teddy bear. Throughout years of skilled womanizing, Binti had never needed words of tenderness, but now he began searching his memory for them. He found none. His childhood had been without kindness or love, but never before had he realized his loss. "It's just a flesh wound, kiddo," he said finally, but by then Kosher was sinking into unconsciousness. Binti had got an oxygen mask on him now. The burnt place in Kosher's chest bubbled with froth, and the silk glove that held it disappeared under pink foam. In the cockpit, Battersby rephrased a question in his mind a dozen times before asking it. Finally he said, "Shall I follow the elevator controls back to the tail?" "Good idea," said Lambert. "I'm the lightest weight," said Battersby. "I might be able to get to the rear turret. See what you can do, Batters. Take your chute with you. Can you hold her alone? Ease off your weight, and we'll see." Lambert found he could hold the control column forward, but only by jamming his leg against it and twisting his body in the seat. "Okay." Binti shone his torch up at Battersby, who stepped over the two men huddled together on the floor. In spite of an icy wind, the smoke still hung inside the plane. Battersby looked down dispassionately when he got to the hole in the fuselage. He had never been afraid of heights, and he studied the edges of the damage with a technical eye. Battersby found the rudder control rod badly bent and kicked at it, but his strength was not sufficient to change the bend or even to make another. He reached along the rod to where it entered the tailplane spar, but it was undamaged as far as he could reach. He flashed his torch, but could still not see the damage. He plugged in his intercom to the connection near the LSAN. "The rods are not too bad. Probably the elevators themselves." "Skip, what's it? There's nothing you can do about that, Wilmar." "Batters. See if you can get as far as the rear turret to see if Flash is okay." Suddenly they all heard Flash Gordon's voice. "Rear gunner to captain. I'm all right." "Where the hell have you been?" asked Lambert. "Sorry, Skip. My plug came adrift." "I've been calling you and wondering what was happening," Battersby said. "Skipper, would you let Flash come forward, his weight so far aft?" He left the rest of it to Lambert to imagine. "Can you come up here, Flash?" Lambert said. "We're in a bit of a mess amidships. So watch your step and bring your chute with you. Battersby is somewhere back there. Do as he tells you, okay?" "Okay, Skip," said Flash. "I could tell there was something wrong. My turret would only work on manual, and there was a terrible smell." Flash came forward. He was stiffened by the coldness of his open-panel turret and impeded by his parachute. When he got as far as Binti and Cohen, he sat down on the floor with them. It seemed warm there where the metal structure had smoldered. The only true tiredness stems from the ball of the foot. First it makes the calves ache and the thigh muscles throb and moves along the spine to produce a pressure upon the cranium that almost forces the eyelids closed. That was the sort of tiredness Lambert knew now. He felt as if he had marched 50 miles in full equipment. Yet with no navigator to help him and no wireless operator to obtain radio fixes, he was trying to draw a triangle of velocities in his head. It was no use him remembering courses they had drawn up at the briefing, for those winds had proved to be hopelessly incorrect and were probably still changing. In any case, he had brought the Lancaster down to 4,000 feet so that Kosher wouldn't lack oxygen, and here the winds might be different again. "Shall I see if I can work the wireless set for a QDM?" Digby offered. "Stay up front. Help me get a pinpoint when we cross the coast." He had wandered far off the track of the bomber stream during Beer's attack. The moon was bright now, but all it showed him was the sea beneath and irregular formations of cloud ahead. He knew that if he was to make a landfall, he must stay below the cloud, and when the first particles wetted and darkened the perspex, he put the nose down until he could see again. The ocean was close below them. Those cold, spiteful waves looked so gentle from here, parallel and unmoving. They were patches of white cross-hatching drawn by moonbeams through the clouds. Lambert had resolved that in this situation he would ask the crew whether they wanted him to turn back over the enemy coast and bail out. But he did not ask them. So many times he had brought back dead and dying. Now once again he was doing it, while he himself was unscathed. Ruth said that he couldn't hold himself responsible for that, but she didn't understand. He steered the kite. A touch of the foot. A movement of the hand changed their position by half a mile. Anything that happened was his fault. There was no escaping it. No authority without responsibility. They did as he told them without a murmur of protest. Cohen had gone back to the flare chute. No one had asked to bail out, nor had they mentioned that had he reacted more quickly to the flagship's guns, they would not have been hit. "Battersby, take an extinguisher and have a careful look round amidships. If you can find the Aldis lamp, take a look at the engines through the wireless window. The dials are fine. Skipper. All of them are running beautifully by the look of it. Stay here, lad. I'm just being neurotic." "Okay, Skipper," said Battersby, racked by the guilt of not being disabled. Binti held tight to Kosher and tried to make amends, in a low voice, stumbling sometimes over the polysyllables and coughing because of the smoke. He recited nut for nut and bolt for bolt every component of the 4 motorcycles he'd owned. Flash sat on the floor, listening to the litany and trying not to look up at the upper turret. At the controls, Lambert and Battersby were struggling with the cantankerous, unpredictable, crippled door. In the front, Digby was staring down at the sea, trying to make it into land. Finally, he succeeded. "It's the English coast, all right. Aldeburgh. Southwold. I can see the river. Yes. Well, I'm just a visitor here myself. Sport." 2 searchlights lit and searched the sky, passing close to their wingtip. "Skipper to crew, I can put down at the emergency field at Manston or try to find Worley." There was no answer for nearly 2 minutes. Then Binti said, "Let's get Cohen back home." "Home it is," said Lambert. Masked by the effects of the morphine, Cohen was slipping into a coma. Binti rocked him in his arms. "Nearly home. Kosher. Old son." Then he began to cut his burned flesh away from the flare chute. Tommy Carter's ground crew and air crew were celebrating the pilot's 21st birthday by bumping him on the hard tarmac. His flying gear deadened the shock of the buffeting. After 21 bumps, he got to his feet, surprised and a little angry, although when he saw Roland advancing on him with a tray of glasses and beer, he was suitably placated. Every one of the ground crew was holding a glass of beer before Tommy would take one. The sergeant electrician held up his glass and said, "Many happy returns, Tommy lad, and here's to you and your next posting. Tapper. Old son." They all drank happily. They'd hardly begun the second drink when one of them started up the song that had become Tommy's anthem. It was a well-known RAF ditty, sung to the tune of "In and Out the Window." The captain's name was Carter. He was a champion farter. He could play everything from "God Save the King" to Beethoven's Fourth Sonata. They all joined in the chorus of orbiting the beacon, orbiting the beacon, orbiting the beacon, as we have done before. They were so pleased with the harmony at the end of it that they repeated it all through again, and there was more clinking of glasses. "Here you are, Tom," said Ben Gallagher, toasting his captain. "You're the best bloody driver in the Air Force." By the light of the vertical searchlight and the flashing beacon, Tommy could see that they were happy, and the dangers and difficulties of the night were temporarily forgotten. Lambert and Digby both saw the vertical searchlight and told each other. For a moment, their tiredness disappeared. Using only his ailerons, Lambert had brought Dor around all the way from the coast. Degree by degree, he had prepared the heading so that from 50 miles away, he was approaching the main runway. 9.5 miles from Worley, he began his landing. Flash and Binty held Cohen tight. The funnel lights were coming up too fast, but old Dor was trying. She really was doing her best. Lambert controlled his height by means of the throttles, letting the aeroplane drop gently through the air as it lost forward speed. The elevators were still useless. "I'll need all your weight, Mickey," Lambert told Battersby. The flare path was floating gently up towards them. Battersby put the undercarriage down, and to their mutual relief it slid into position and locked with no trouble. "Give me 20 degrees of flap." "Flaps down," said Battersby. The approach was good. "Flash and Binty, okay?" "Okay, skipper. Hold on tight to the structure. If the tail breaks off, it will only be the end bit. Don't slide out. Digby, come back here. Battersby." 60 degrees of flap. Please. He was more than 400 feet above the trees and still dropping nicely. Worley's spire came up and pierced the skyline as Lambert struggled with the control column. Now he needed those elevators. Just this last time. Dor. My love. Battersby and Lambert strained upon the controls until they both feared that they might bend the metal. Neither of the men spoke. They were overshooting. Still the wheels hadn't touched. They were flying across the airfield at 100 miles with an altitude that could be measured in inches. "I can't hold her," muttered Lambert. They were sinking almost imperceptibly. Continuing on this shallow slope would bring them into violent and final contact with the ground in the middle of Wych Fen or, even worse, the copse just beyond it. Desperate, Lambert decided to slam all the throttles forward into emergency boost. He even started to reach for them, then paused. He doubted if the fragile machine could stand it, and he knew that his subsequent circuit would have to be halfway across East Anglia since he couldn't use the tail to steer. The airspeed needle quivered and dropped to 90 mph. Still, there was no bump of wheels touching. "This is it," said Lambert. He cut the throttles right back. At speeds above its stalling speed, any aeroplane is a fairy princess caring nothing for the law of gravity. But, like Cinderella at midnight, a plane going even a fraction below its stalling speed changes suddenly into a collection of metal components that, exactly as a brick, bomb, or pumpkin bouquet, will drop earthwards as gravity demands. Dor did that. It fell upon the runway like a fist upon a counter, shaking every rivet. The tires screeched like half-slaughtered dogs and repeated the scream as the bouncing plane reapplied their hot rubber to the hard ground. Lambert had every last inch of flap down now, but they were still racing at 60 miles an hour towards the line of trees that marked the far end of the runway. "She's swinging," said Battersby, but already Lambert was trying to correct it. Two trees came up through the pale skyline, stabbing their fingers into the air in a rude gesture at having been singled out for doom at the hands of a runaway bombing plane. Then the world went mad. Battersby knew that it wasn't possible that they could sink into the runway, and yet he knew beyond doubt that it was happening. Lower and lower. There was a very loud bang that shook the whole aeroplane. There were flashes on every side and a shower of yellow sparks filled the cabin windows. The skyline detached itself from the airfield, and danced first round to the port windows and then more determinedly to starboard. This time it kept going, and there were hangars in front of them, then the lighted windows of the control tower, and then those damned trees came round again. The noise was tremendous. Metal was ripping itself to pieces in a frantic rhythm that matched the dance of the trees until, as the horizon lost its energy, the tumult slowed and stilled, and there was a silence such as they had never known before. Digby for a moment thought he was dead. Then he heard the gurgling sounds of petrol flowing from broken tanks and the creaks and cracks of the bent metal settling down. There was a smell of scorching and of 100-octane fuel, and with it the similar sweet perfumes of human juices and fresh blood. They were all speechless and still. Even had the wreckage been on fire, it is doubtful that they would have moved. Nowadays, aeroplane accident investigators call it negative panic. Then they called it being stunned. "Sorry, lads," said Lambert. "Had to bring the undercard up. Out as quickly as you can. There's a fire hazard. Got kosher there. Binti?" "Yes. Skip. We'll see to him. Flash?" "'Kay, Skip. Have you got Flanagan?" Lambert reached for the cross-eyed rag doll. "Yes, Flanagan's okay," he said. Lately he'd begun to hate that doll, but never more than now. He stuffed it into his tunic. "Dig. Ready to go. Unplug. Get clear. Side doors best. Take it easy." Only then did the crew recover their senses enough to unplug their microphone leads, release their parachute harnesses and make for the exits. Lambert gave Battersby a blow on the arm to tell him to hurry, and he patted the aeroplane an affectionate farewell. For a moment he sat looking at his aeroplane. He felt an irrational sadness at saying goodbye to the wreck. There was a lot of noise now, bells and shouts and ambulances and fire engines. Flash and Binti carried Cohen about 100 yards before they sank down with him onto the cold ground and looked back towards door. Bent and broken and well off the runway, one wingtip had snapped and was silhouetted. Pieces of tail were scattered everywhere. Digby came racing past soon after they had stopped. He saw them and dropped down beside them, puffing and panting with exertion. "Lord bless you, but Mother Earth," he said. The smell of the dew-wet grass almost overcame the smell of Cohen. There was still no sign of Battersby. He was in the shadow of the wrecked bomber, standing by the exit waiting for Lambert to emerge. He could hear him moving around. Soon, Lambert appeared in the doorway carrying something. Battersby moved to assist him, but then found he couldn't. "You'll be all right, Jimmy," Lambert was saying to the wet bundle. One after another, the Lancasters came in on the main runway that took them over the village roofs. Old Sam Thatcher gave up the attempt to sleep and switched on the light by his bed and looked at the clock. "That damned wind. I knew she'd move round." "I said so to young Cynthia. Go to sleep," mumbled Mrs. Thatcher. He switched out the light, but did not go back to sleep. Finally, he got up and made himself tea. In the briefing room, there was a shot of rum for every returning crewman, and a short, dark waff with carefully applied makeup handed out cups of sweet, milky tea. 2 airmen were removing the shutters from the windows. There was a trace of watery pink colouring the eastern sky. The debriefing officers were sitting behind folding tables writing furiously as the crews grouped round them trying to recreate the raid. It was not possible. Their descriptions relapsed into jargon and cliché. Their voices were shrill, and their grimy faces bore the red scars of oxygen masks like painted smiles on dirty clowns. The sudden realization that they had survived was far more intoxicating than one measure of Air Ministry rum. I got a real good burst in at him. Definitely a Messerschmitt, wasn't it? "Cliff?" "I didn't see him." "Dave, you stupid sod. And this is your 20th trip to him." "Captain?" "Right on the target, man. But I couldn't tell what colour the smoke was. Krefeld, as a city, no longer exists. If you don't believe me, look at my photo. It sounds like a good show, a piece of bloody cake. For the bombs that missed Altgarten fell upon open land and did not burn. And so from the air, the destruction of the little town appeared to be a highly concentrated and remarkably accurate attack upon the sprawling city of Krefeld. Longfellow was pleased. It will be something to tell your children about, he told Lambert. But Lambert had already resolved never to tell anyone. The crew drifted away to their breakfast, still talking noisily. Lambert did not leave the room when the debriefing had finished. He waited. He always waited, but this time he waited in vain. He saw no sign of Murphy or any of Sweet's crew. Out on the cold airfield, half a dozen ground crew stood around on S for Sugar's tarmac pan. They'd heard distant singing from Carter's crew, but that had made them even quieter. They were wrapped in woolen helmets and long scarves. Their hands were thrust deep into their overcoat pockets and were only removed to light and relight cigarettes. The ground beneath their feet was dotted with white, trampled butts. The men did not speak to each other except to ask the time. The sergeant fitter had done his basic training with Murphy. Finally, he said, "Go and get some breakfast, lads." The distant screech of the London train came clearly across the dark fenland. They walked slowly back across the airfield, staring at the ground and hoping they wouldn't see anyone they knew. At Kroonsdijk, Christian Himmel was the last of the Staffel to land. The dud engine gave trouble during taxiing, but Himmel expected that. He came past the old wreck quite fast, and then Kugel brought him into position with hand signals. He hit the port toe brake so hard that his plane swung round abruptly on its pan. He brought the motors up to maximum revs. The motor banged as he tested the faulty magneto. He switched both engines off. The gyros ran down with a sweet, musical hum, and the cooling motors chimed prettily. Beyond Kugel there was a group of men. The medical officer was there, and Christian could see Radenbacher, too. A nervous flying control officer hurriedly switched off the runway lights. "What's happening?" he asked Kugel, as his feet touched the ground at the bottom of the ladder. Now that he had taken off his mask, he was aware of the stink of the junkers, burnt oil, exhaust fumes, stale cordite and carbonized guns combined with the smell of his sweaty clothes. Kugel was looking at him in a curious way. Perhaps because of this. Himmel stretched his limbs. It was a welcome relief after his cramped, closely fitting bucket seat. On the far side of the airfield, near the dike, there were flashing torches and motorcar headlights. He could tell from the movements of the torches that there was confusion and haste. Kugel was bursting with news. A fellow from 20 came in to refuel and left pieces of his undercarriage scattered along the runway. His flaps and brakes had failed. It caught fire. 2 officers were trapped in it. Horst Knoll rescued them, but he's badly burned on the hands. Funny, eh? Him hating officers the way he does. "Give me a cigarette, Kugel." The old man selected one and pushed it into Himmel's mouth. They walked away from the aeroplane before Kugel produced his matches. Although it was still quite dark, the birds were singing noisily. "It's been a bad night. Christian." The Staffelkapitän has been snatched, and now they think that Lieutenant Cocker has also gone. The other Staffeln have lost 4. "You'll have to change that engine, Kugel." "She cut on me tonight in the middle of an interception." "It may not have been oiled plugs." "It was oiled plugs," insisted Himmel. "And the valves are dud too. You heard it. Anyway, the Commodore said it should be changed if it gave any more trouble." Kugel lit a match and Christian bent his head down to it. "We'll put a new motor into her." "Christian."
By the way, Löwenhertz's Knight's Cross came through on the teleprinter. It will be best. Löwenhertz dead. Are you sure? The radar people at Ermini saw the explosion out at sea. A shell from a flak ship, they think. He would have got his Knight's Cross from Reichsmarschall Goering in person. And Cocker? At first they thought it was his radio, but he's not landed anywhere. Perhaps they'll turn up, said Christian. Take good care of the dog or Löwenherz will be furious. The Commodore's waiting for you, Kugel warned. And that old civilian fellow. I was expecting them, said Christian. In my locker there's a bottle of brandy and an American parachute canopy. You can have them. And the medical officer is there too, said Kugel. Yes. He would want to watch, said Christian. He's a student of human nature. Kugel looked over his shoulder to be sure the crew were out of earshot. Hit me, said Kugel. What? Hit me and run. Hit hard so it's convincing.
You are a good friend. Kugel, said Christian. Take good care of the dog. He walked towards the group of men waiting for him. At Wally Fen, Monroe brought his Lancaster down as lightly as a feather. He kept the wind under his port wing and held off his damaged tire, tilting the controls gently so that it met the runway as gently as possible. So lightly did it touch that a gust of crosswind plucked the aeroplane back into the air and replaced it on a parallel run 10 feet to starboard. The lower a tire's pressure, the lower is the speed at which it will come off its rim. In spite of Monroe's skill, the soft tire was punched flat by the hard tarmac rushing past at 80 miles an hour and then ripped into long rubber strips that scattered onto the runway, wriggling like hot black snakes as they curled into strange contortions and went hard and brittle. Devoid of its tire, the wheel hub struck a long gash of white sparks across the darkness before digging into the tarmac, bending and tearing itself into 8 pieces that bowled along, pealing like a set of bells. But when the oleo leg touched the ground, it was as if the port wingtip had been grabbed by a giant, and the Lancaster twisted neatly off the runway before settling lopsided onto the dew-wet grass, almost undamaged. It was only 200 yards from the wreck of the door. "Ground flight to ground," said Monroe. With formal precision, an aeroplane died each time that order ended its flight. The lights flickered off. The instruments ceased to glow. The intercom ceased to talk, and the generators and gyros whined to a standstill. "Ground flight to ground it is, sir," said the engineer, turning the switch without any hurry. Monroe released his mask, unplugged, unstrapped, turned and thumped his parachute harness release and reached for his peaked cap and walking stick. "Damn me! Look at that, Jock!" He waved the broken end of his walking stick. A tiny fragment of shrapnel had cut it in two. Monroe shivered and decided he'd never carry a Lucky Charm again. If before trying that dodgy landing he had known it was broken, he'd have been convinced he was for the chop. "Congratulations, Skipper," said Jock. "Good landing and the end of a tour." "Thanks, Jock." The briefing room was littered with cigarette ends, and the air was heavy with stale smoke and the odour of Air Ministry rum. When Monroe's crew had been interrogated, the room was almost empty. A large notice on the wall said, "Crews, don't wait around to see your photos. Go to bed." Before they used that sign, the place used to be packed with noisy aircrew until the morning. The intelligence officer pulled his greatcoat tighter about him and looked at the clock. Monroe saw him looking at it and shook his head sadly. The 3 missing planes did not have enough fuel still to be airborne. Longfellow gathered the sortie reports together and went out. The 3 men who had been waiting for friends near the entrance also left, without a word to each other. In the sergeant's mess they played the gramophone, and the mess waiter went around complaining about sergeants who put their wet beer glasses on the billiard table. One sergeant gunner punched a friend who had refused to corroborate his claim for a Ju-88 shot down. A bomb aimer was sick in the bar after drinking whiskey mixed with rum. One of the sergeant cooks who was due on breakfast duty next morning came down to the lounge in his pajamas and asked them to make less noise. He was greeted with foul abuse. Sergeant Binty Jones allowed his friend Flash Gordon to push his motorcycle out of the boiler house where he kept it. It started at a touch of the kickstarter, and Binty stuffed a toothbrush into his pocket and was off to his rendezvous with Rose in Peterborough. He bumped his bike across the unofficial footpath behind the mess to get to the main road by the shortest route. He hurried along it, straddling the bike and letting his toes tap the ground just to keep his balance and giving the powerful engine little twists of throttle. He was almost level with a man coming the other way before he recognized who it was. "Some of you fellows," protested the squadron commander in amazement. "Where are you going?" Binti was too surprised to lie. "Peterborough, sir. To see some woman, is that it?" "Yes, sir," said Binti, unable to keep the nervousness he felt out of his voice. Impulsively, Monroe said, "Well, how about giving me a lift to Peterborough station? I might just be able to catch the mainline train home." He touched his pocket and heard the crackle of his wife's letter. "Certainly, sir," said Binti, in obsequious relief at not being charged with breaking out of camp. He turned the motorbike round. "Jump on the back. I'll take you up to the officers' mess and wait for you." "That's the spirit, Gordon." "Jones, sir. Gordon's my oppo. I'm the mid-upper on Creaking Door Bar." "Oh, Orange, that is. That's the spirit. Sergeant Jones. Peterborough. And don't spare the horses." "No, sir." "I won't, sir." When Lambert left the briefing room, he could hear the gramophone in the sergeant's mess and smell the fried bacon of the aircrew breakfasts. Tommy Carter, Tapper Collins, and Jock Hamilton from Monroe's crew almost dragged him to the mess to join them for a drink, but he wouldn't go. He heard Digby say, "Fair's fair. Sam's got to see his missus." Tommy had a bottle of whiskey that he had put in his locker. It was already half gone. They wished him good night and wandered away, singing. "Happy birthday, Tommy," Lambert shouted after them. They were singing the famous soldier's song, "That's my brother Sylvester. He's got a row of 40 medals on his chest. It takes all the army and the navy to put the wind up Sylvester." The chorus was a tuneless chant sung as speedily as possible. "Don't push, just shove, plenty of room for you and me. He's got an arm that's like a leg, and his punch will sink a battleship." Digby ended long after the others, and clinging to Tommy's waist, he swung round to shout goodbye again to Lambert. Lambert waved again. Digby shared a room with Grimm and Cohen. Tonight, he'd have the room to himself. That's why he'd not be going to bed. By the time Lambert reached the changing room, it was empty. He was opening his locker when Battersby emerged from the crew toilets, even paler than usual. He wiped his mouth and said to Lambert, "Was I all right?" "Skipper." Lambert winked at him. "Like a bloody veteran." "Batters." The boy smiled. "I phoned the sick bay." "I did too, Batters. I was going along there, but they said it was no use. They're doing all they can. Get some sleep. Batters. The worst is over." The boy was full of unasked questions, but he smiled and turned towards the door. Lambert reached for his shoes on the shelf and in them found the group photo. They were all there, grinning like immortals. He tossed it into the back of his locker and after it threw Flanagan. He pulled off his boots and flying suit and went to have a wash but changed his mind. Someone had been sick in the WC. There was a bulb missing and the only towel had been stolen. He unlocked his bicycle and pumped up the rear tire. He had to push the bike through the gap in the wire because the constant battle between the breakers and the repairers was going a little in the latter's favour. After that, it was only 10 minutes' cycle ride to the village. The sky was dribbling with the first streaks of a new day, and the air was cold enough to condense his breath. Lambert liked these rides. The countryside was still and aromatic, and there were rustles of animal life in the hedgerows. For Lambert, it was the moment to congratulate himself upon surviving another trip. He propped his bicycle against the hedge and opened the front door as quietly as possible. Ruth was awake when he opened the bedroom door. She was always awake when he returned. He imagined she never slept while he flew, although he never asked her about it. He undressed slowly, without the light. The moonlight that had shone so brightly over the Dutch coast was diffused by the thin cloud and dusted the bedroom with just a trace of blue gloom. "All right, darling?" Lambert didn't answer. And that, she knew, was bad. The only other times that he'd been silent was when they'd been shot up and lost crew. When he got into bed, he lay full length with his feet together like a block of wood. Or like a corpse, thought Ruth, and erased that thought. His skin was hard and his breathing was almost inaudible. She put her head against his shoulder. He didn't either respond or move away. He'd come back. There was that for which to be thankful. It wasn't only cowards who died 1,000 times. It was wives and mothers and sweethearts. Fathers, too, perhaps. "Cohen and Grimm," said Lambert. He didn't mention Mickey. She said nothing. "I promised his father," said Lambert. "He made you promise," said Ruth. "I promised." She wanted to tell him about the group captain, but she couldn't add another worry. "It's Tommy Carter's 21st birthday. They wanted me to go for a drink. You should have gone." "No." A motorcycle came through the village at high speed, changed down at the crossroads, and then opened the throttle with a roar as it turned onto the main road. Lambert bent over his wife and kissed her. "I didn't wash," he apologized. She could smell the awful night. "I sent Dad a $5. You are a fool, Sam. He won't use it to pay his bills. He'll bull. He'll never be any different." "I know, you can't be responsible for all the world, Sam. You mustn't try."
"I'll not go again. They can do what they like. Ruth, I'm flown out. Finished. Kaput." She reached to her bedside table and found a sleeping tablet for him. He took it like a small child, not caring what it was or where it had come from. "Perhaps you should play cricket on Saturday. Well, we can go to London the following week. You're a good girl. Ruth." He put his arm round her and closed his eyes, but he did not sleep. That was about the time when they found the burgomaster. They all said it was the most obvious place to look, but no one said that until after he'd been found. A Hitler-Jugend messenger almost ran over him on the wrecked site of his own house. He had collected as many undamaged bricks as he could find, and he was building them into walls. He had no cement, of course, which is why they fell over when the boy's bicycle hit them. The burgomaster was very upset, and so the 14-year-old messenger helped him build his little hut again.
It was almost an hour before the boy realized that the burgomaster was trying to build the tiny hut around himself. In Lieberfrauplatz, a team of Tano engineers led by WWII were heaving at a block and tackle. The sound of the chains rattled around the ruins of the still-warm church. With each pull, the tail assembly of Sweets Lancaster rose higher until it was strung up in the town centre, suspended from a buttress. It swayed a little in the winds that had so aided the great fires of the night, looking like a piece of some prehistoric animal, displayed thus to assuage the anger of the gods. Smoke drifted across the scene. On the rudders there were the red, white and blue markings of Britain, and the white stenciled letters that were its identity. Some of the Tino men wanted to leave the body of Sweet's rear gunner in the smashed rear turret, but WWII forbade it. Even before the cables were secured, citizens had begun to gather to exorcise the species that had plagued them. "Sieg Heil!" shouted one of them, and the others also shouted. Sweet's wrecked aeroplane would stay there a week and then be melted down, and within 7 weeks fly again as a German aeroplane. Luftwaffe Himmelbett Station Ermin was lucky with the mail. They were the first Luftwaffe unit along the coast on the mail route from Rotterdam. There were 2 letters for August Bach. One was from the jeweler in Altgarten. It was a receipt for the deposit and a bill for the engagement ring. As the jeweler said, an engagement ring is the riskiest item that a man can offer on credit. The other letter was from August's son. With characteristic confidence, it was date-lined, "Near Leningrad. Pappy, haven't got more than a moment. We were in the line until only 4 hours ago. Last night I was on patrol trying to get prisoners for questioning. Both died of wounds, and tonight the company that relieved us will have to have another try. We are pretty sure that Ivan is all ready to attack us. When he does, I shall get my promotion or a wooden overcoat. Either way, it doesn't matter much, as long as I don't get wounded." Answers to questions? No. What we get to eat is entirely adequate. Eat your own rations? Yes. We shall be getting leave sometime during the next 2 months. Yes. I am coming home. Do you think I'd miss another roll in bed with that juicy little housekeeper you've tucked away? I was telling the boys about her. As one of them said, trust the Luftwaffe to get itself some civilian rations and then pretend they are going hungry. He meant you, of course. And don't go all sanctimonious on me. See you sometime in August and knock before coming into the bedroom. Yours cheerfully. Peter P.S. Answer to unasked question. I haven't forgotten and will pay you back very soon now. August folded both letters and put them into his piatocket. Reinecker, he said. After breakfast, I'll sentence the men who lost the bicycles. We'll see to the cash afterwards. Anyone sick? Only me, sir, said Reinecker, and grinned. No, said August. There are 2 of us. You'll feel better after some coffee. Real coffee. The herons? They've gone. At the guardroom at WWII Fen, Flight Sergeant Bishop was looking at his galleon in full sail. He couldn't decide whether to call it Cadiz Ahoy or Gold from the New World. The phone rang. The operator spoke to Bishop, who was for tonight the sergeant of the guard. It's some police station with a message, she said. I can't get any answer in orderly room or operations. Okay, said Flight Sergeant Bishop. Let's have them. WWII Fen RAF? That's it. Cambridgeshire Constabulary here. Sergeant Ford speaking. We've got 2 of your people here. There's been an accident between a Norton motorcycle and a lorry. They were speeding, by the sound of it. Their names are... There was a pause as he shuffled the document on his desk. Monroe, John, Wing Commander, and Jones. William Gareth, Sergeant. Know them? I know the Wing Commander, but almost everyone is a sergeant on this station. Very well. I take it your military police people will phone us in the morning to make your own arrangements, and there's the damaged motorcycle to be moved too. Wait a moment, said Bishop, grinning to himself as he thought of it. You can't hold the Wing Commander in the cells until morning, not for a traffic offence. I'm sorry, I should have explained. Dead, killed instantly. They hit the lorry at 90. Okay, said the sergeant. I'll leave a note about it. He replaced the phone. Cadiz Ahoy, he decided, would be better. In the 3 kitchens at WWII, the cooks were still heavy with sleep as they sat drinking their first mugs of sweet, hot, milky tea before they began to prepare the earliest of the early breakfasts. Maisie Holroyd, the catering officer, had a cup of tea and a joke in all 3 messes, in spite of having been on duty supervising the air crew's flying rations until the middle of the previous night. The sun was clinging precariously to the horizon and killing the stars with its stare. Lambert turned in his sleep, groaned, laughed, and went silent without waking his wife, for she had not yet gone to sleep, and now she watched him like a mother with a sick child. In the medical section, 2 doctors stood upright for the first time in 2.5 hours and let Sergeant Cohen die. In Altgarten, they had long since run out of death certificates and were using pages from children's exercise books with the rubber stamp of the rat house imprinted at the top. They had also run out of bandages, blood, splints, burn dressings, iodine and morphine. There were explosions as the Ternos demolished houses and shops on Dorfstrasse. Voss's shop was one of many that had become a dangerous ruin. The metallic voice from a loudspeaker van moved slowly along the same road, telling the homeless to report to Party HQ for information and assistance. It ordered next of kin to report missing persons to the new temporary police station, a house on Zieglerstrasse. The only way to get there was via Collar Meadow. For like many of Altgarten's streets, it was partly roped off because of unexploded bombs. Not far from Altgarten, Billy Pace was the only survivor from Sweet's aircraft. His landing, however, had not been a lucky one. He had seen the dark shapes of the fir trees only a moment or so before hitting them. A branch struck his leg, and then he was assailed by the sharp edges of more branches before he was jerked to a sudden stop by his canopy catching the treetop. There was a tearing sound, and he sank a few feet, but then swung without descending more. It was pitch dark in the forest, and he tried to get a grip on a branch, but they were all flimsy and springy and would not bear his weight. He tried to peer into the gloom but could see nothing. He found matches in his pocket and struck one, but that only illuminated the branches close to him and seemed to make his surroundings even darker. He dropped a burning match, but it went out before he could see beyond his dangling, stockinged toes, for he had lost both flying boots. Suspended in the tight harness, he was so uncomfortable that he was tempted to hit the quick release and chance it, but caution prevailed, especially when he heard the cry of wolves nearby. He dangled there for 3 hours, with his imagination working overtime until the sun came over the horizon and inch by inch lit up the dark forest. It was then that he saw that the earth was only 18 inches below his toes. He let himself drop to the ground, but was still nervous of the wolves until a forester came past and explained that they were caged dogs. Pace had dropped into the small wood behind the walled hotel and had heard the noise of guard dogs being rounded up by dog handlers. He walked along with the forester to his hut and managed to exchange a few words of German. Behind the forestry hut, Billy Pace saw a stiff, brown, doll-like figure. Its little arms were drawn tight across its front like a boxer's high defense, and its burnt mouth was stretched back in a demoniacal grin that exposed large, even white teeth. Pace recognized the charred stubble of a moustache. It was young Speak, who had left S Suite without permission. He had landed in a patch of blazing forest. The forester let Pace look at it for a moment or two. "Kamerad." "Yeah." "Kamerad," said Billy Pace, and he went into the hut feeling hot and faint and slightly sick. The old man gave him a cup of bitter brown liquid that he claimed was coffee, and then he used the fire warning phone to send for an escort. Billy still had a chocolate bar left from his flying ration. The old man ate it with relish. As the old forester explained, he would be safer with soldiers than walking through the bombed town without protection. He showed the forester a photo of his mother. Pace wondered how long it would take for his mother to hear that he was a prisoner and not killed in action. For Fleming and his crew, no comrades grieved. Their only friends had been each other, and none came back. Their stay at WWII had not lasted long enough to form friendships with the experienced crews, and who could blame the men who came back for preferring that their friends survived rather than 7 strangers? In the officers' mess at WWII, the education officer was collecting together the personal effects of P.O. Fleming. He'd been made effects officer only a week before. He made certain that there were no pornographic photos and read the letters carefully to be sure that they could cause no distress to parents or wives. It was a solemn job. He looked at his list. The next one was Flight Lieutenant Sweet. When the last of the bombers landed, the work of Wally Fenn's photographic section began. Each of the bomber's F-24 cameras was unloaded, and the 5-inch wide lengths of extra high-speed film were threaded onto spools and processed. It was all done at high speed. The developer was at 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and they had only a 3-minute fix and wash before going into a methane water bath for rapid drying. The flight sergeant then took the wet film and ran it across the front of a light box to check the exposure and development. He noticed nothing unusual. nor did anyone else until the films were being hung in the hot air of the drying cabinet by a WWII corporal. She went into the trimming room and for a moment looked across the airfield. Several of the buildings were lit up, their windows making bright yellow patches, disembodied in the blue morning light. The paths and grass were shiny wet with dew, and the beacon still flashed a Morse identity that lit everything like a lightning stroke. The girl found a shiny photograph that had been taken during a previous attack upon Krefeld and studied it carefully before looking at the negatives again. She told an lady before telling the flight sergeant. She didn't want to make a fool of herself. "Flight Sergeant Booth here, sir. Photo section. The attack hasn't hit Krefeld. Sir, I've just been studying the negs. Street patterns are nothing like it. I don't know, sir. It doesn't look like anywhere. It doesn't look like anywhere. Gericht der Wehrmacht-Kommandantur Berlin vor den 2020. 8. November. Lehrterstreck 15. WWII to the Supervisory Board of the Penitentiary in Brandenburg, Gurden, on Monday, September 13th, 1943, at 1 p.m. The death sentence against former Unteroffizier Christian Himmel. Born September 12, 1922, in Ottobrunn, Bayern, religion Catholic, will be executed with the guillotine in your prison. Executioner Röttger is charged with carrying out the sentence. The sentence is to be notified there on the same day at 1100. Charged with the supervision of the execution is Oberleutnant Dr. Henze, who will be attended by Feldjustiz Inspector Kaiser. The sentenced is in the remand prison of the Wehrmacht in Berlin-Tegel, Seidelstrasse 39. The Polizeipräsidium. Berlin, as conveying authority, is requested to send the sentenced to Brandenburg on the morning of September 13th, 1943. Acceptance is requested. The local prison doctor is requested to be made available for the execution. By direction, signed, Jost Oberkriegsgerichtsrat, Administration Officer RAF Station, Worley Fen. August 23rd, 1943, ACH G.D. Lambert, Samuel Charles. The above named has been found unsuitable for any further duties in aircrew capacity, and his reduction from NCO rank has therefore been ratified by Air Ministry. With effect from this date, he will report to the Station Warrant Officer for work assignments with cleaning, sanitation and refuse disposal working parties. While these duties are not intended as a punishment, no privileges will be granted to AC Lambert until further notice. This to include passes or permission to sleep off the station. To Station Warrant Officer RAF Worley Fen's epilogue. Some forgot the events of that night in 1943. Others could never forget, and many did not live to remember. Löwenherz, Fleming and Sweet, and the crews that flew with them were not the only ones to die. The Luftwaffe lost 8 night fighters, 3 Ju-88s, 4 Me-11Os and a Dornier 217, as well as 3 others that landed so heavily as to be written off strength. 10 Luftwaffe aircrew died, and 2 more were hurt so badly that they never again flew in combat. The RAF's losses were 44 bombers, of which 31 fell to German night fighters. 301 crewmen were lost. Of these, 68 survived to become POWs. 9 of this latter group were seriously injured. Of the RAF aircraft destroyed, 30 had already bombed. 5 aircraft jettisoned their bombs in the sea or in open country. 1 bomb load accidentally fell upon a Dutch village and caused 8 deaths and 3 injured. Of the RAF aircraft destroyed, 9 were lost to flak, and 1 was lost when an RAF night fighter misidentified it and shot it down as it crossed the English coast 40 miles south of the flight plan. 3 bombers made fatal navigation errors. 1 descended through cloud and crashed into a mountain near Stavanger in Norway. Another ran out of fuel 160 miles east of the Orkney Islands. 1 crashed in the south of France after being shot up. All of the crews perished. P.O. Monroe, John Monroe's brother, a Sterling pilot. Survived the raid and completed his tour of operations. He now runs his brother's estates, having married Sarah, his sister-in-law, and brought up the child and sent him to university where he studied law. Tommy Carter and his crew were killed 4 operations after this one. Lambert never flew again. Ruth was posted away, became pregnant, left the WWII and stayed near her husband for the rest of the war. After the war, Lambert went to work as a draftsman in an aircraft factory. In 1954, he patented a supercharger modification and went into business manufacturing it. He is happy and moderately wealthy, although like many bomber pilots, he has a history of spinal pains and disorders. They have a daughter and 2 sons. Battersby, Flash Gordon and Digby were reassigned to a new pilot. They completed their tour, were posted to training command, and then returned to do 4 trips of a second tour before the war ended. On the last operation, they were badly shot up, and Flash Gordon lost his left arm. Many Lancaster turrets were modified to have a clear view panel. The group captain persuaded Air Ministry to officially name this the Suite Panel. Battersby married the WAF driver that he met that night. After the war, he went to London University, just as his father had planned, and, somewhat to his father's surprise, chose to study English medieval history. He has written a book on medieval fortification and is at present a visiting professor at a large American university. Digby returned to Australia. He has the Australian agency for a British light plane manufacturer and travels round the country selling them to farmers on the assurance that if he could learn to fly them, anyone could. Sometimes the customers ask him if he was in the Air Force during the war, but Digby stoutly maintains that he was too young to be in the war. Now completely bald, he wears a toupee. Jammy Giles left the RAF in 1949. He was drinking a lot by then and couldn't get used to the fact that post-war officers' mess parties had become rather more staid than he liked. His mother died and left him a little cash with which he started to buy a pub near Stratford-upon-Avon. In the first year it made money, but that led Jammy into a false confidence. For really, he is not a good businessman. Careless bookkeeping and generosity with credit made him bankrupt in 1954. However, after working as a waiter for 2 years, he had another go at running his own place. While at his lowest point economically and psychologically, he had met and married a beautiful girl named Bessie. Together they started a lorry driver's cafe on the A1 only about 30 miles from Worley. Jammy admits that it owes its success to Bessie, who works twice as hard as he does. She handles all the buying and hiring and firing and, as Jammy says, more drivers eat here to see her than to see me. However, sometimes squadron people visit them to recall old times. There are dark, fly-blown pictures on the wall of Jammy standing under Lancaster bombers and one of him receiving his DFC from the King. Only 2 years ago, Peterson called in and they were laughing about the time he did a bombing run seated on the Elson. Peterson lives in Montreal and is a vice president of a small company that makes camping equipment. In 1948, Cohen's parents both died within 3 months of each other. Nora Ashton still lives with her mother in the house down the lane. It puzzles some people that she never married, for they guess, rightly, that she had many proposals. The group captain died in 1946 in a car accident in Germany while he was still in the RAF. Willy Reinecker also got a job with the RAF in Germany after the war, although he had to falsify his age to do it. He worked in air traffic control for nearly 5 years before retiring to live in the Ruhr. His son now works for Lufthansa. Also in air traffic, Fisher got another medal soon after D-Day. He was awarded the Oak Leaves after rounding up a group of stragglers, including cooks and clerks, and, using Panzerfäuste, repulsing an attack by British tanks outside Caen. He was killed after being cut off from his division in the fighting near Essen. He established a strong point with 150 men and refused all demands to surrender. Artillery fire destroyed them. He still had the 300-year-old Kuba carpet with him. It was found in the ruins by an Rasky driver and ended its days as a floor covering in his lorry. Frau Voss survived the war. Using the few works of art that her husband had, with typical foresight, stored in his son-in-law's house, she was able to live comfortably in Portugal until she died in 1959. Bodo Reuter also survived the war. He worked on a freight boat for a year and then met a man in Athens who gave him a job crewing a luxury yacht for a Greek millionaire. For the first time in his life, he began to drink to the point where it interfered with his work. He was dismissed and went to work on various ships, but it was on a Panamanian oil tanker that he continued for the longest period, working as a cook. On Christmas Day, 1952, two policemen found a derelict old man on a park bench in Le Havre. He'd sold his seaman's papers to buy wine, so they were unable to identify him. They filled in his death certificate by guesswork. Shrewdly, they guessed he was German, but as one of the flicks said, he looked more like a poet than a beggar. They compromised and wrote schoolteacher, August Bach's SS son Peter. Within 9 days of writing his letter, won one of the Army's most coveted awards, a badge for the single-handed destruction of a tank. 3 days after that, he was promoted, and 4 days later, on rest behind the lines, he died of shotgun wounds inflicted by a partisan. August Bach is now a very old man with pure white hair and wrinkled skin. He went to Brazil after the war, married a local girl and had 2 sons and a daughter. The first job he got was with a small company that builds powerboats for fishing enthusiasts, mostly from the USA. After 4 years, the owner gave Bach a small share of the business, and a few months after that made him a full partner and retired. Bach was an old man already, but by bringing his son and son-in-law into the business, he has expanded its trade every year. Bach's younger son, Hans, returned to Germany. Having already flown light planes in Brazil, he got a job with Lufthansa and was trained as a pilot. He now has done nearly 3,000 hours on jets. August Bach and his wife spend most of their days in their small cottage on the beach. In some ways it is not unlike the hut he had at Ermin, and he still photographs birds, and sometimes dissects them. At Ermin itself there is virtually no trace of the radar station, although the concrete gun emplacements are still there. Dutch birdwatchers go there on Sundays in the summer, but there are no herons there now. The nearby drainage workings have disturbed them. The surviving Scheske twins served a 6 months prison sentence for shooting the dogs but did not see combat until the closing weeks of the war. He was captured by the Red Army and served 11 years in a labor camp in the extreme north. He was a sick man when he was released and was permitted to go to West Germany where he had relatives. He is unmarried and works as a storekeeper in a plastics factory near Hamburg. He only got that job because the manager was also in the Waffen-SS and felt sorry for him. Hans Firth was taken prisoner by the British in 1945 and continued to work as a doctor in the camp and later for Allied military government. He ran as a candidate in the local elections but did not win. However, one of the people who worked for him on the election campaign was the Munich manager of an American public relations company. Firth was offered a job in the Chicago office. He worked for them for 8 years and then left to start his own PR company in New York. Nowadays, he works there only 2 days a week and is able to afford long holidays in Florida and a trip to Europe once a year. Originally, most of his clients were German manufacturers moving into the US market, but now those are in the minority. Firth has become so American in his clothes and speech that very few of his clients guess that he is not a native. For this reason, he only employs American-born staff with the exception of an English secretary, an English receptionist, and an English telephone operator. For the image, Dr. Starkhoff, the Abwehr man, was arrested after the attempt to assassinate Hitler on July 20th, 1944. He conclusively proved his innocence and so escaped the death sentence. He was, however, sent to a concentration camp, and although he was still alive when the American troops reached it, he died only 3 months afterwards. The burgomaster went into a mental home and died before the war ended. The young Myers, who got married with Andy Neal's aid, immigrated to Israel, and now work on a fruit farm near Jerusalem. Radenbacher became an Oberst at OKL and was killed flying as a passenger in a Ju-52 in January 1945. Old Krugelheim was killed when a low-flying USAAF Mustang shot up the Kroonsdijk airfield in late 1944. The airfield itself still exists, although it is only half its former area. There are only light planes flying from it today, although there is a two-motor aeroplane that for only 15 guilders takes sightseers for a quick circuit of the Jaisalmer workings. Those same workings drained a vast area of sea and found the remains of Cocker's Ju-88 last year. Although it was intended for a museum, it broke up when being moved. Worley Fen's runways are still in position, although they cannot be seen for growing crops. If you go there today, you will also find some of the other buildings. The sick quarters where Cohen died have become sheep pens, and the remains of the sergeant's mess, where the gramophone was once so loud, now echo to the grunt of many pigs. Only the control tower is in anything like its original condition, although if you ascend the iron staircase, be careful. You might end up writing a book about it. Afterword Bomber was the first fiction book written using what is now called a word processor. In 1969, that name did not exist. It was an IBM engineer visiting my home at the Elephant and Castle in London to check my golf ball typewriter, who asked me, "Do you know how many times your secretary has retyped this chapter?" He waved pages in the air. "Half a dozen times," I said defensively. I knew my wonderful Australian secretary Eleanor Handley retyped chapters only when her typewritten words were almost obscured by my handwritten changes. 25 times, said the IBM man. Your poor secretary. I tried to look repentant. Along the street at the mighty Shell Centre, IBM had installed banks of computer-driven machines that produced printed in-house essentials such as instruction manuals. "Come along and see them," urged the IBM man. Being somewhat obsessed by machinery while not really understanding it, I went along. Soon I became the only private individual permitted ownership of an IBM MT-72 computer. It was the size and shape of a small upright piano. I was very proud of that machine. I showed it to everyone who visited me, but it was Eleanor who mastered it. My friend Julian Simons, the writer and doyen of critics, said I was the only person he knew who actually liked machines. "Perhaps you should write a book about them," he said, only half seriously. That was the start of Bomber. Does everyone hate machines? Perhaps they do. So suppose I wrote a story in which the machines of one nation battled against the machines of another. Yes, I knew about that. I had been bombed every night for months at a time in London. The night bombing campaigns were fought in complete darkness, with both the enemy aircraft and the terrain below depicted only as tiny blips and blobs on glass screens. The combatants never saw their enemies. It had a spooky fascination for me, but would such a grim, mechanical theme overshadow a story's human element? The human element was already a difficult aspect of writing such a story. Most of the characters, both British and German, would be able-bodied young men chosen for their physical, emotional and psychological similarity. To make it more difficult, my preliminary notes showed that I would need a cast of well over 100 of these similar young people. This meant a style that would bring a character to life in only a sentence or two of dialogue, and do it well enough for the reader to pick up on that character 2 or 3 chapters later. And I was determined to do it without resorting to crude regional pronunciations. It was daunting. I began to talk to experts and discovered how deep I was going to have to dig for my research. German radar was very advanced by 1943. It was only after that that Anglo-American technology took the lead. But the Germans lost their technical lead and lost the war too. That meant that very few people had taken any interest in the history of German air defenses. I went to Germany and sought out the technicians and radar operators, as well as the night fighter pilots and flak crews. Then I had to put their explanations together well enough to understand the basis of the German air defense system. The more I learned about it, the more it fascinated me. If 1943 German radar controllers and night fighter veterans were a complex challenge, then wait until I started to delve into the social life. Scandals and Nazi-led politics of a small Westphalian town. Everyone seemed to have a war story. One lady found for me some striped overalls that she had made from her nurse's uniform. A man I met in a restaurant had kept all his wartime documents, and when I showed interest in them, insisted that I kept them. My wife Isabelle's fluent German was the key to this conversational research and greatly expanded the number of people and stories available to me. It was almost overwhelming, but it was too late to stop. And anyway, I enjoy research. One large room of my London home was devoted entirely to Bomber. I collected everything available: films, air photos, logbooks, letters, recordings, teleprinter orders and target maps. Pasting aeronautical maps together, I covered one whole wall with Northern Europe. Tapes of the bomber routes, turning points, doglegs and feints showed each aircraft in the story. Tabs for times meant I could see where each fighter or bomber would be at any chosen moment. The anchor of the story was to be found in England's Bomber Command airfields. I knew many of them from my time in the RAF, and I returned to see them again. My RAF veterans were great companions with anecdotes galore. And during my service years I had flown in Mosquitoes and in Lancaster bombers. In Germany, Adolf Galland found for me some of the best of his night fighter crews. The Dutch Air Force allowed me to spend some time on a military airfield that was very little changed from 1943. By amazing luck, I was able to enter and climb around one of the very few Luftwaffe Opera House command centers just days before its demolition began. It was a vast, echoing place, and by chance the demolition crews had left all the electric lights burning, probably for safety reasons. Back in London, my good friends at the Imperial War Museum gave me a room filled with Luftwaffe instructional films about the night fighter version of the Junkers Ju-88, and by bending the rules a little, I also got to climb inside one. Right from the first notes, I had decided upon the 24-hour time format. It meant that I would describe only one RAF bombing raid, but I could depict it in detail. By describing mechanical elements, such as the number of fragments into which the average anti-aircraft shell breaks, I wanted to emphasize the dehumanizing effect of mechanical warfare. I like machines, but in wars, all humans are their victims. Len Dayton, 2009.